Early on the evening of Sunday, the 27th of November, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Woods was leaning towards the mirror in her small New York City apartment. She was carefully applying her eyeliner, her hands steady, a skill she'd perfected over countless nights just like this one. Her phone, sitting on the bathroom counter next to her makeup, buzzed. She heard it, but she didn't even glance over to see who was calling. She just didn't have the time. Her shift started at 7, and she couldn't afford to be late. Catherine had moved to the city from Ohio 3 years earlier. She had that big, bright dream that pulls so many people to New York. She wanted to be a dancer on Broadway. She imagined her name in lights, the roar of the crowd, the feeling of being on stage under the hot theatrical lights. But New York City is an expensive place to have a dream. Just existing here costs a fortune. So, in between chasing that Broadway dream, she was working. A lot. She actually had 3 different jobs just to keep her head above water, to pay the rent, and to afford the lessons she needed to even have a shot at her dream. 2 of her jobs were pretty normal. She was a waitress at a busy diner, where she was quick on her feet and had a friendly smile that earned her good tips. She also taught dance classes to little kids, their energy and enthusiasm a welcome contrast to the cynicism of the city. She loved seeing their faces light up when they nailed a new step. But tonight, she was getting ready for her 3rd job. And this job was different. It wasn't something she talked about. In fact, she was deeply embarrassed by it, and she kept it a secret from almost everyone she knew, especially her family back in Ohio. Her 3rd job was at a place near Times Square called Flash Dancers. She was a topless dancer. Catherine really, truly hated the work. The leering eyes, the fake smiles she had to put on, the way it made her feel. But the money was good. It was really good. And that money was the fuel for her dream. It paid for the expensive voice lessons and the advanced dance classes that were essential if she was ever going to make it to Broadway. She lived in Manhattan, the most expensive borough in an already incredibly expensive city. She knew she could save a lot of money if she moved to a cheaper neighborhood in a different borough like Queens or Brooklyn. And when she had first arrived in New York, that's exactly what she'd done. She'd found a small place in a less expensive area, thinking she was being smart and practical. But that practicality had come at a terrifying cost. Her landlord there had sexually assaulted her. The experience was so traumatic, so violating, that it nearly broke her. For a while, she seriously considered just giving up, packing her bags, and moving back home to Ohio, leaving the city and her dream behind forever. It felt like the city itself had chewed her up and spit her out. But in the end, after a lot of soul-searching, she decided to stay. She was a fighter. She wasn't going to let one horrible man destroy everything she had worked for. But she did make a change. She moved. She found her current apartment in a much safer part of Manhattan, where she felt she could walk down the street at night without constantly looking over her shoulder. To help with the much higher rent, she got a roommate. His name was David Hahn. He was 23, and he was a familiar face from back home in Ohio, a little piece of her old life in this new, overwhelming city. At this very moment, as Catherine was finishing her makeup, David wasn't in the apartment. He'd gone downstairs a few minutes ago to get his car, which was parked a few blocks away. He was going to drive her to her shift at the club. Catherine finished with her eyeliner, satisfied with the clean, sharp line. She left the bathroom and walked through the small living room. On the floor, a black dog was sleeping soundly. She had to step carefully over it. The dog wasn't hers, and it wasn't David's either. David was a part-time dog sitter. It was one of the many side jobs he juggled to make ends meet, just like her. This particular dog was just staying with them for a few days while its owners were out of town. When David wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a fancy hotel just up the street from their apartment building. Catherine and David had a history that was a bit complicated. They had actually been a couple at one point. They dated for a little while after he followed her to New York. But these days, they were just friends, just roommates, splitting the bills to survive in the city. Although, if Catherine was being honest with herself, she sometimes wondered if they should give it another shot. Just a few days ago had been Thanksgiving. Instead of making the long trip back to Ohio like she usually did, she had stayed in New York and celebrated with David. Just the two of them. And it had been really nice. It felt comfortable, easy, like coming home. A big part of what she appreciated about him was that he knew about her job at Flash Dancers. He was one of the very few people who did, and he didn't judge her for it. He understood why she was doing it, and that lack of judgment was a rare and precious thing. But there was one major hurdle she could see if they were to ever get back together. It was David's attitude towards other men in her life. He seemed to dislike basically every single man she ever met or dated. It didn't matter who they were. He just had this immediate, almost instinctual distrust of them. Now, with some of the guys, she could kind of see his point. There was a guy named Joe she had dated for a short time. She had met him at the strip club. He was a customer. David had been very clear that he thought Joe was bad news. And in hindsight, he was probably right. But then there were other guys, like Paul. Paul was a personal trainer at her gym. She'd gone on a few dates with him, but it was nothing serious. They were more like friends who spoke on the phone every now and then. Paul had always been perfectly nice to David, polite and friendly whenever he saw him. But David still insisted that Paul was a creep. He just had a bad feeling about him. For now, though, Catherine pushed those thoughts aside. She didn't have time to sort out her entire romantic life. She just needed to get dressed and get downstairs before David started wondering where she was. She went into her bedroom, and that's when she heard it. The dog in the living room suddenly started barking. It wasn't a playful bark. It was sharp, insistent, like it was barking at something or someone. Curious, Catherine walked out of her bedroom to see what was going on. A little while later, David Hahn was walking quickly along the sidewalk, his breath misting in the cool November air. He was heading to his car, parked several blocks away from the apartment. He was already feeling a bit rushed. He finally reached the car, jumped in, and started the engine. He drove back towards his building, navigating the busy Sunday evening traffic. As he pulled up to the curb in front of his apartment, he took out his phone and called Catherine. He expected her to answer right away, to say she was on her way down. But the call went straight to voicemail. That was odd. He tried again. Voicemail again? He sighed, a little annoyed, and put his hazard lights on. He got out of the car and headed into the building to go get her. He took the stairs 2 at a time up to the second floor. As he turned down the hallway towards his apartment, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, standing right in the middle of the shared hallway, was the black dog he was supposed to be dog-sitting. Somehow, it had gotten out of the apartment. David just stared for a second, totally confused. Then he realized there was someone else there. His neighbor, a man named Brad Stewart, was standing right behind the dog. Brad was holding a leash, and it was clipped onto the dog's collar. Brad looked a bit surprised to see David, and David was just trying to process what was happening. Why did his neighbor have the dog on a leash in the hallway? Brad spoke first. He explained that he'd been coming up the stairs and had found the dog just wandering around by itself. He said he recognized it as David's dog, so he'd brought it back to their door. Brad said he had just knocked, but nobody had answered. At this point, David understood why Brad had the dog, but the bigger question was still unanswered. How did the dog get out in the first place? He didn't ask, though. He just thanked Brad, took the leash, and stepped over to the door of his apartment, number 2D. The door was closed, but when he tried the handle, he found that it was unlocked. He couldn't remember if he'd left it unlocked when he went to get the car. It wasn't something he would normally do. He pushed the door open and called out Catherine's name. There was no answer. Just silence. And that was really weird. She should have been right there, waiting for him. He stepped inside, the dog trailing behind him. He didn't see Catherine in the living room, but he did see that the door to her bedroom was slightly cracked open. He walked over to it and called her name again. Catherine, we're going to be late. Still nothing. He pushed on her door, expecting it to swing open. But it didn't. It moved maybe a few inches and then stopped hard. He could feel resistance from the other side, like something heavy was on the floor blocking the door from opening. And now, with all these strange little things piling up the dog in the hall, the unlocked door, the silence, the blocked bedroom door, a feeling of serious worry started to wash over him. A surge of adrenaline hit him, and he put his shoulder into the door and shoved it hard. It flew open. He stuck his head inside to see what was blocking it, and when his eyes adjusted to the light, what he saw made him recoil instantly. He pulled back, stumbled out of the room, ran back into the hallway, fumbling for his phone, and called the police. About a half an hour later, around 7:30 in the evening, an NYPD detective named Stephen Getz walked up the stairs of an apartment building in a nice part of Manhattan. This area was known for being extremely safe. Murders just didn't really happen here. But if the 911 call he'd just heard was accurate, he knew a potentially grisly murder scene was waiting for him in apartment 2D. When he got to the second-floor landing, he saw that a few other uniformed NYPD officers were already on the scene. One of them was talking to a young, skinny guy who was standing in the hallway looking completely distraught. The young man was holding a leash, and at the end of it was a black dog that was sitting quietly at his feet. Another officer saw Getz arrive and walked over to brief him. He said the man being interviewed was the victim's roommate, David Hahn. He was the one who had found the body and called 911. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment, in the back bedroom. Getz nodded, his face grim, and walked down the hallway, past David and the dog, toward the open door of the apartment. His plan was always the same. He wanted to see the scene for himself before he started questioning anyone. Getz pulled on a pair of disposable rubber gloves and began his initial assessment. He carefully examined the doorframe of the apartment and then the door itself. He was looking for any signs of a break-in, any splintered wood or scratch marks around the lock. He saw nothing. No damage at all. That told him something important right away. Whoever did this either had a key or was let inside. He stepped into the apartment. The small living room was a little bit messy, but it was a lived-in messy, not a violent messy. The futon was pulled out into a bed, and there were some men's clothes strewn about. It just looked like a typical New York City apartment shared by young people. Getz moved slowly through the living room, taking care not to disturb anything. He headed towards the back of the apartment, towards what he assumed was the bedroom where the body was located. The door to the room was open just wide enough for him to slip through. When he stepped inside, the scene changed dramatically. There was blood everywhere. It was spattered on the walls, on the furniture. The room itself looked like a tornado had gone through it. It had been completely torn apart. A dresser drawer was hanging open, and women's clothing was scattered all over the floor. The mattress had been ripped completely off the bed frame and was now lying crookedly on the floor. That's what had been blocking the door from opening. And then, in the middle of all that chaos, in a large pool of blood, lay the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her for a closer look. She was wearing only a t-shirt and underwear. On the front of her t-shirt, he saw a very clear, distinct shoe print. It looked as if her killer had literally stepped on her chest during or after the attack. There were at least a dozen stab wounds all over her body. He also saw what he immediately recognized as defensive wounds on her hands and her forearms, little cuts and slices that told him she had fought back hard against her attacker. She had fought for her life. But the worst of her injuries were to her neck. Whoever had killed her had slit her throat with such savage force that they had nearly decapitated her. To Detective Getz, this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. This was an attack fueled by an absolute, uncontrollable rage. At that moment, Getz heard footsteps behind him. He stood up and turned around to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. The blocked door was making it difficult for people to move in and out of the bedroom, so one of the first things the forensics team did was to carefully pick up the mattress from the floor. They leaned it up against the wall, out of the way, so the bedroom door could now swing open freely. With the team now able to access the room properly, Detective Getz stepped back and let them do their work. He watched as they meticulously documented everything. He saw them carefully lift the shoe print from the t-shirt Catherine was wearing. Then they found a second, identical shoe print on her bedsheets, and they collected that one as well. To Getz, both of these prints looked like they came from the exact same shoe. And just by looking at them, he could tell they were made by a man's shoe, probably an average size. This immediately made Detective Getz curious about something. He stepped out of the bedroom and back into the living room. He quickly found a couple of pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor near the futon. He picked one up and looked at the sole. While the tread pattern didn't match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom, the size looked about right. They appeared to be the exact same size. An hour later, at about 8:30 that night, Detective Getz sat down at a metal table inside an interview room at the NYPD's 19th Precinct. He slid a bottle of water across the table to David Hahn, the roommate of the murder victim. And, at that moment, Detective Getz's number one suspect. The facts were simple and damning. There was no sign of forced entry at the apartment, which meant Catherine's killer either had access to the apartment or was led inside by someone who did. The murder weapon was a knife, and the sheer brutality of the attack screamed personal motivation. It felt like a crime of passion. Even though Catherine's bedroom had been completely trashed, nothing of value seemed to have been stolen. And because Catherine had been found partially undressed, a sexual motive was also a strong possibility. So Getz's working theory was that this murder was committed by a man who knew the victim well, had easy access to her home, and possibly had a romantic or sexual connection to her. David Hahn fit that profile perfectly. Plus, he apparently wore the same size shoe as the killer. Although, as Detective Getz settled into his chair and took out his notepad, he did a quick, subtle scan of David's hands and forearms. He saw no visible cuts, no scrapes, no bruises. That was a little strange. Getz figured that a fight as violent as the one Catherine had put up would have almost certainly left a mark on her attacker. But he didn't mention this to David. Instead, he just leaned forward, his expression sympathetic, and asked David to walk him through everything that had happened that day. David's hands were shaking a little as he reached for the water bottle. He took a deep breath to try and calm his nerves. He said he had been at the apartment with Catherine that night until about 6:40. That's when he left to go get his car so he could drive her to her 7 o'clock shift at Flash Dancers. But, he said, getting his car had taken longer than he expected. On the way, he had run into a couple of his coworkers from his doorman job, and he had stopped to chat with them for a few minutes. He said that after he finally got his car and drove back to the apartment, he had expected Catherine to be waiting for him out on the curb. But when he got there, she was nowhere in sight. She didn't answer her phone when he called, so he'd gone inside and run upstairs. In the hallway, he said, he had found his neighbor, Brad, who was for some reason holding the leash of the dog David was supposed to be watching. Then David said he went into the apartment, and that's when he found Catherine's body. He said he called 911 immediately and that it was right around 7 o'clock. As David said this, Getz stopped writing on his notepad and just looked up at him. He could not believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he was only out of the apartment for 20 minutes, and in that tiny window of time, Catherine had been brutally murdered, and her killer had managed to escape without anyone seeing them. It was, honestly, one of the weakest alibis Getz had ever heard in his career. But he didn't let his skepticism show. He didn't want David to know just how close he was to being arrested, because he didn't want David to shut down and stop talking. So Getz kept his tone very calm and understanding as he asked how long David had known Catherine. David explained that they had met a few years ago back in Ohio while Catherine was home visiting family. They started dating, and he eventually decided to move to New York to be with her. But not long after he arrived, Catherine broke up with him, and she had asked him to move out of the apartment. David said he hadn't been able to afford a place of his own, so he had started sleeping in his car. He said Catherine had felt bad about that, and so she had eventually let him move back in, but on one condition, that he slept on the futon in the living room and that they were just roommates. By now, Detective Getz's pen was flying across the page. This new information was a bombshell. David wasn't just Catherine's roommate. He was her ex-boyfriend. A spurned ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see her alive and the first person to find her body. Getz was now more confident than ever that he was sitting across the table from Catherine's killer. He told David that everything he was saying was incredibly helpful. But he said he needed to go check on something really quick. David agreed to wait. As Getz stood up to leave, he stopped at the door and turned back. He asked David one last, seemingly casual question. He asked him what his shoe size was. Without a moment's hesitation, David answered that he wore a 10.5. Getz jotted this down on his notepad, and then he left the room. What he didn't tell David was that the reason he was stepping out was to get some crucial updates from the forensics team and from the uniformed officers who were, at that very moment, questioning David's neighbors. And once Getz had that information, he was going to come back and use it to try to catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, around 3 in the afternoon the next day, Detective Getz was sitting at his desk, feeling completely exhausted. He was pounding yet another cup of bitter office coffee. He had been up all night long interrogating David, who was still, at that very moment, sitting in an interrogation room just down the hall. Getz had also been going back and forth with his team, getting updates from forensics and from officers out in the field, and he still had a mountain of paperwork to get through before he could even think about going home to sleep. Right now, he was going over a new batch of reports from the officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building, asking all the neighbors if they had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And just as Getz had suspected, the information they were getting was starting to poke holes in David's story. David claimed that he had left the apartment at about 6:40 and that at that time, Catherine was perfectly fine. But 2 different neighbors reported hearing screams coming from that apartment well before 6:40. The man who lived in the unit directly above them said he had heard 3 distinct screams at exactly 6:28. And the people who lived in the apartment right next door to them said they'd heard screaming, a dog barking, and the sound of furniture being moved around even earlier, sometime between 5:45 and 6 o'clock. Now, none of these neighbors had called the police or done anything about the noises because the sounds had stopped pretty quickly. In a crowded New York City apartment building, strange noises were a part of life. And then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had found the dog. Brad told police that when he ran into David in the hallway, it was sometime between 6 and 6:30. But David had insisted that he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body at about 7 o'clock, a full half hour later. Now, Getz knew from experience that witnesses were often unreliable when it came to specific times. And in a dense building, it was easy to get noises from different apartments confused. But still, all of these inconsistencies were adding up. It was looking more and more like David's alibi had serious problems. The detective sat back in his chair, took another sip of coffee, and then his phone rang. He picked it up. It was the forensics team, and they had an update on those shoe prints from the crime scene. They had confirmed that the prints on Catherine's t-shirt and on the bedsheets were indeed left by a man's shoe. They were a men's size, 10.5. This was the exact size David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and then rushed back to the interrogation room for another chat with David Hahn. This time, though, Getz did not offer him a bottle of water. He just sat down, looked David straight in the eye, and confronted him with all the new evidence. He told David that the killer's shoe prints were exactly his size. He told him that his neighbors had heard screams coming from his apartment long before he claimed to have left the building. And he told him that Brad Stewart said he'd seen him in the hallway at least half an hour earlier than David had claimed. Getz then leaned in close and played his trump card. He told David that there were security cameras in the apartment building and that his officers were in the process of getting the footage right now. So, if David had anything to confess, he had better do it now, before the cameras proved he was lying. Getz watched as David's expression shifted from exhaustion to pure, raw fear. It seemed like this was the first time that David was truly realizing that the police did not believe his story for a second. After a moment of stunned silence, David insisted, his voice cracking, that he had not killed Catherine. He begged Getz to believe him. But when the detective just glared back at him, his face a mask of stone, David launched into a brand new story. It was a story he had not mentioned at all in the nearly 20 hours he had been interrogated. David said that Catherine knew this guy named Paul Cortez. He said she had dated him for a while, but that David had always thought he was a creep. David said Catherine had even told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So, David said, the police really needed to go investigate Paul, not him. To Detective Getz, this sounded like a desperate, last-ditch effort from a guilty man trying to cast suspicion on someone, anyone else. But he also knew that he had to follow up on every lead, no matter how flimsy it seemed. So he wrote down Paul's name and told David they would look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the evening, David was still in the interrogation room. And outside on the steps of the precinct, reporters from all the major newspapers were beginning to gather their cameras at the ready. The following morning, the story of Catherine's murder was everywhere. Pictures of her smiling face were on the front page of every paper in the city. The headline on the New York Daily News made Detective Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper." The article inside reported that Catherine's family back in Ohio hadn't even known she was working as a topless dancer until they flew to New York to identify her body. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He wasn't convinced that Catherine's line of work had anything to do with her murder, but the papers were determined to run with that angle. A media circus was the last thing he needed. His team was already under immense pressure to make an arrest, and now they were going to be flooded with tips from the public, most of which would be useless. Getz put down the newspaper, got up from his desk, and walked down the hall to an interrogation room. He had ended the day yesterday feeling pretty sure that David was his killer. He had finally sent David home, but with strict instructions not to leave the city. He fully intended to arrest David, and soon. But first, he had to do his due diligence. He had to follow up on the other leads he had, if only to definitively rule them out. And one of those leads was sitting in the interrogation room right now, waiting for him. It was Paul Cortez, the man David had named. Officers had tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. The man who was supposedly obsessed with Catherine. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was subtly look down at Paul's shoes. He could see they were a pretty typical size, maybe a 10 or an 11. At a glance, they could easily be a 10.5. Getz also looked for any scratches or bruises on Paul's hands and arms. And he did see one small injury, a little cut on one of Paul's fingertips. Getz asked him about it. Paul explained calmly that his finger had just gotten pinched between a couple of weights at the gym where he worked as a trainer. Paul was very calm, very soft-spoken. He said he had heard about Catherine's death in the news, and he was devastated. He just wanted to help the investigation in any way he could. When Getz told him that they had gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just kind of rolled his eyes. He said that David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine. Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago, and they had been dating on and off ever since. He said that at the time of Catherine's death, they were in an off phase, but he still cared about her deeply and had hoped that one day they might get back together for good. Paul told Getz that he hadn't seen Catherine in person on the day she died, but he had spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon. He said this wasn't unusual. They still talked on the phone from time to time, even when they weren't officially together. Paul said he had actually tried to call her a second time later that day, but she didn't answer. He said he didn't think much of it at the time. Then Paul laid out his alibi for that night. He said he had gone shopping with some friends, and then later he went to a local bar to watch the Jets game, which started around 8:30. Getz made a note to check Paul's alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might want to kill Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes seemed to light up, as if he'd just remembered something important. He said there was this other guy, a kind of stalker named Joe. He had been one of Catherine's regular customers at the strip club. He said that months ago, this guy Joe had somehow gotten Catherine's personal phone number and had started contacting her outside of the club. Paul said that around that same time, Catherine had been drugged at work. Someone had slipped a roofie, the date rape drug, into her drink during one of her shifts. Paul said that even though he could never prove it, he had always suspected that it was Joe who had drugged her. He said Catherine had eventually cut off all contact with Joe, but the whole incident had really bothered Paul. It bothered him so much that he had tried to convince Catherine to quit her job at the club, but she had refused. Paul even admitted that he had gone so far as to call Catherine's father in Ohio to tell him how worried he was about her. He said Catherine had been furious with him for doing that and had stopped talking to him for weeks. Getz jotted all of this down. Then he asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this Joe. Paul said he didn't have Joe's number, but he was sure it was in Catherine's phone. Because he said the very last time he spoke to Catherine on the phone, on the afternoon of her death, she had mentioned something that had really surprised him. She said that after months and months of silence, Joe had started calling her again, completely out of the blue. At this, Getz studied Paul's face, searching for any sign that he was lying. This whole story about Joe could just be a clever way for Paul to deflect suspicion from himself. But Paul seemed sincere. It didn't feel like he was making it up. And besides, it would be simple enough to verify his story by checking Catherine's phone records. Detective Getz hated to admit it, but maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe it was time he started looking seriously into some of the customers from Catherine's secret life at the strip club. The following afternoon, on Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was feeling deeply annoyed as he hung up the phone at his desk. It had been another call from another reporter demanding an update on the case. But Getz had no updates to give. He hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was staying tight-lipped. For now, he just turned his focus back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he had subpoenaed the day before. And they showed that Paul Cortez had been telling the truth. The records confirmed that both Paul and a man named Joe had called Catherine shortly before she was killed. So, Getz had his officers track down Joe and bring him in for an interview. He asked Joe to explain why, after months of no contact, he had suddenly decided to call Catherine on the very day she was murdered. Joe claimed he was just calling to check in, to say he hoped she had a nice Thanksgiving. He insisted he was just trying to be friendly. But then, Getz asked Joe point blank if he had ever put a roofie in anyone's drink. At this question, Joe's eyes went wide. He started to stammer and sputter, and he swore that he would never, ever dream of doing something like that. But based on Joe's panicked reaction, Getz had a strong feeling that he was lying. And so now, the entire investigation felt like it was wide open again. Just a few days ago, Getz had been absolutely certain that David Hahn was the killer. But now, all these other men from Catherine's life just kept coming out of the woodwork. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just 1. In fact, at this point, his original suspect, David, was actually starting to look more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's coworkers from the hotel, and they confirmed his story. They said he really had stopped to talk with them on the street on the evening of Catherine's death, just like he had claimed. And while Getz had hoped that the security camera footage from the apartment building would definitively prove David was lying about his timeline, it actually did the opposite. The footage showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38, which lined up perfectly with his story that he left around 6:40. Now, this didn't completely exonerate him. Based on what the neighbors had heard, Catherine could have been killed before he left. But there weren't many cameras in the old building, and there was no camera covering the second-floor hallway outside of apartment 2D. So the footage couldn't prove one way or another who, if anyone, had gone into that apartment while David was gone. Just then, his phone rang again. Getz reached for it, expecting it to be another reporter. But this time, he was pleasantly surprised. It was a member of the forensics team, and he could hear the excitement in their voice. They told Getz that they had just discovered something big, something they had completely missed during their first sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensics tech explained that when they had first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had taken that mattress that was blocking the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But when they had done that, the mattress had accidentally covered up a crucial piece of evidence that was on the wall the whole time. It was a bloody handprint. It wasn't until a couple of days later, after they had carefully gone over everything else in the room, that they finally moved the mattress back down onto the floor. And that's when they saw it. Getz's face lit up when he heard this news. This was the break he had been waiting for. Now he thought all he had to do was go get handprints from all three of his suspects and see which one matched. It seemed like it would be that simple. But he quickly realized he had a major problem. By this point, some of his suspects had already gotten lawyers. And their lawyers were advising them not to speak with the police anymore, let alone voluntarily hand over their handprints. And Getz couldn't legally force them to give their prints unless he arrested them first. And so, Detective Getz found himself in a frustrating catch, 2-2. He needed the suspect's handprint in order to make an arrest, but he couldn't get the handprint unless he arrested them. So at this point, the investigation stalled. Weeks went by. Detective Getz grew more and more frustrated because there was nothing he could legally do to push the case forward. Meanwhile, the case was still getting a ton of coverage in the press. And to the public, it looked like the NYPD was just dropping the ball. But then, on December 16th, 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the very news coverage that had annoyed Getz so much ended up giving him exactly what he needed. That day, a woman called the NYPD because of something she had seen on the front page of a New York newspaper. And what this woman told them led Detective Getz directly to Catherine's killer. Based on all the forensic evidence and the numerous interviews police conducted, this is what they believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of the 27th of November, 2005. Shortly after 6:40 in the evening, the killer climbed the stairs inside Catherine's apartment building. They knew that at that very moment, she would be alone in the apartment, getting ready for another shift at Flash Dancers. The fact that she worked there, that she had this secret life, bothered the killer more than they ever let on. The thought of Catherine dancing for other men, giving her attention to other men, filled the killer with a jealous rage they could barely contain. The killer had tried to win her over, had tried to talk her into being with them exclusively, but she had rejected him. So, in the killer's mind, the time for talking was over. And so, the killer walked quietly up to the door of apartment 2D. They reached down and turned the handle. It was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, the killer pulled out the knife that they had hidden inside their sweatshirt. But then, something they had not planned for happened. The black dog that was lying on the apartment floor jumped up and began to bark at them. For a split second, the killer thought about just turning around and leaving, abandoning the plan. But then, Catherine, alerted by the dog's barking, came out of her bedroom. She looked right at the killer, and she saw the knife in their hand. Catherine screamed and turned and ran right back into her bedroom, the very bedroom that she had made explicitly off-limits to the killer in the past. And just the thought of that, of her trying to keep him out of her space, sent a surge of pure anger through them. The killer charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the other side of the bed, trying to lift up the heavy mattress to use it as a shield. But the killer was too strong and too fast. They forced their way past the mattress and grabbed Catherine from behind. But Catherine was a fighter. She fought back with everything she had. She began thrashing and kicking, scratching and biting, doing anything she could to break free. But she couldn't. They struggled wildly around the small room, smashing into furniture, knocking things over. And it was around this point that the killer lifted up the knife they had brought and slit her neck as deep as they could. But even then, even with that fatal wound, Catherine kept fighting. She fought with such viciousness that the killer actually had to brace themselves against the wall just to keep their balance. And in the chaos of that struggle, the killer didn't even realize that as they steadied themselves, they had placed their bloody hand flat against the wall, leaving a perfect print behind. Finally, Catherine fell to the floor. but the killer was still blinded by rage. They got down on the floor with her and began stabbing her over and over and over again. And then finally, when Catherine stopped moving, the killer jumped up and ran out of the apartment. But when they got into the hallway, they realized that the black dog that had barked at them had gotten out of the apartment during the chaos. Now, the killer wanted the dog to be back inside the apartment, but the dog was on edge, still barking at them. So instead, the killer just pulled the apartment door shut, trapping the dog out in the hallway. And then the killer fled the building, using a back door where there was no security camera. And for weeks, the killer was not caught, until their violent past finally came back to haunt them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who had no connection to Catherine at all was walking down a street in New York City when she glanced over at a newsstand. And on the cover of one of the newspapers, a picture was plastered across the front page. It was a picture of a man who was currently a person of interest in a high-profile murder case. And this woman was horrified because she knew this man, the killer, had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier, but she had been too scared and ashamed to ever file a police report. But now, seeing his face in the paper, seeing that this horrible person was being investigated for murder, she knew she had to speak up. She called the NYPD and she told them everything she knew. The NYPD's Special Victims Unit used this woman's brave testimony as the basis to arrest the killer for the previous assault. And finally, once he was under arrest, Detective Getz was legally able to get his handprint. And those prints were a perfect match to the bloody handprint found on Catherine's bedroom wall. They belonged to Catherine's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Paul Cortez. David's suspicions about Paul had been right all along. Paul was a creep, a violent predator who had assaulted at least one other woman before he murdered Catherine. Data collected from nearby cell phone towers would later prove that Paul was in the immediate vicinity of Catherine's apartment building right before her murder. The records also showed he had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, Paul waited. He watched until he saw David leave the apartment to go get his car. And then he hustled upstairs, knowing that Catherine would be alone. Even though David was only gone for about 20 minutes, it was more than enough time for Paul to get inside the apartment, murder Catherine in a jealous rage, and slip away completely unnoticed. Paul Cortez was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder on Wednesday, the 23rd of December, 2005. He was later found guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. And just like that, the truth finally came to light. But the haunting question remains, how many stories like this are still unresolved, hidden from view? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you're not ready to stop here, there's still so much waiting for you in the next episode. See you next time. Back in the spring of 1978, a 16-year-old girl named Bridget Geiger was sitting in her bedroom in Ohio, staring at her prom dress. It was a beautiful dress, and she had spent weeks looking forward to this night, but as the date drew closer, she felt a heavy sense of disappointment. She did not have a date to the prom, and she had been worried that she would have to miss the event entirely. But then, a boy from her school named Jeffrey had asked her to go. Bridget was not particularly excited to go with Jeffrey. He was known around school for being incredibly quiet, highly unusual, and extremely nervous around girls. She figured it was going to be an incredibly awkward date, but nobody else had asked her, and she really wanted to go to her high school prom. So, she said yes. On the night of the prom, Bridget got dressed and waited on her front porch. When Jeffrey finally showed up, she was immediately disappointed. He was wearing this odd ensemble of a vest and a bow tie as opposed to the standard tuxedo that she was anticipating him wearing. They did not match at all, and it was clear from the start that they were on two completely different pages. He was also so nervous that he was visibly shaking. His hands were trembling so badly that he could not pin her corsage to her dress. Seeing how much he was struggling and how tense the situation was, Bridget's mom had to come out of the house and put the corsage on for her. After the corsage was finally on, Bridget's mom wanted to take some photos of them. They stood together on the front lawn, but they were incredibly stiff. They looked like two strangers who had been forced to stand next to each other for a photograph. After her mom took a couple of very awkward photos, they ultimately got into Jeffrey's car and headed off for the prom. When they arrived at the school, Bridget immediately wanted to go onto the dance floor to see her other friends. She hoped that being around a larger group of people would lighten the mood and make things less awkward because she was really not having a good time with Jeffrey so far. But she did stay with him, and as they walked around, it became very clear that Jeffrey absolutely hated being at the prom. He hated being around this swarming group of teenagers, and the loud music and bright lights seemed to make him incredibly anxious. Bridget felt kind of bad for him and said, "Hey, Jeffrey, do you want to go sit down and just grab a bite to eat over at the little food cart they have here?" Jeffrey looked incredibly relieved. He looked at her and said, "Yes, I would love to do that." And so the pair left the loud dance floor and walked over to the quiet food court area. As they were about to sit down, Jeffrey pulled the chair out for Bridget. She sat down, and he kind of pushed her in like a gentleman. But then, instead of sitting down with her, Jeffrey just walked away without telling her where he was going. Bridget assumed he was just going to the bathroom, but after a really long amount of time had passed, it was clear he had not just gone to the bathroom. She got up to go look for him. She went onto the dance floor, but she could not find him in the building. And so she went outside to see if maybe his car was gone. She thought maybe he had just left her there and driven home. But when she looked, she saw his car was still in the parking lot. When she turned around to go back into the building, she saw Jeffrey sitting on a curb all by himself, just eating McDonald's cheeseburgers. She walked over to him and asked, "What are you doing out here?" Jeffrey looked up and told her that he had just wanted to step outside and get a couple of cheeseburgers, and then he was going to come back and sit with her while she ate. But the school staff would not let him back into the building because of their strict rules about leaving. And so he had just gone back to McDonald's, got more cheeseburgers, and decided to wait there on the curb until she came outside. Now that she was outside, she could not get back in either. So she just sighed and said, "Hey, I would like to just go home." Jeffrey was mortified. He told her, "I am so sorry. I wanted this to be a nice evening for you, and I am sorry it was not." He drove her home, said goodbye, and she walked into her house. He drove off, and that was that. Bridget only saw Jeffrey one more time after that night. It was about a week after the prom, and Jeffrey actually invited her to come over to his house for what he was calling a house party. Bridget was very skeptical. She thought to herself, there is no way this kid is throwing a house party. He can barely stand to be around just me, let alone a crowd of people. But she wanted to be polite, so she said, "Sure, I would love to come to your house party." When she arrived, she realized her instincts were entirely correct. There was no food, there was no music, and there were only about 3 people there. And as soon as she walked in, all Jeffrey wanted to do was have a seance and communicate with the devil. Bridget was so immediately creeped out by Jeffrey's behavior that after only a couple of minutes, she just turned around and left his house. She did not see him again after that day. Well, she did not see him again until 13 years later, when she would read about him in the newspaper. 13 years later, on the 22nd of July 1991, Milwaukee, Wisconsin police spotted a man named Tracy Edwards running down the road in handcuffs. They ran over to him and asked what was going on. Tracy was terrified. He said that a man was holding him hostage in his apartment and had threatened to kill him. Tracy explained that he had been able to overpower the man and escape, and now he was running for his life. The police went to the apartment that Tracy had escaped from, walked up to the door, and knocked. The door opened, and the police were confronted by a tall man who introduced himself as Jeffrey. He told the police that this was all a big misunderstanding. He said that Tracy was a friend of his, and he did not know what had gotten into him. The police were actually close to believing him. They would even say later that Jeffrey was incredibly convincing, calm, and polite. But as they were talking to him, one of the officers kind of looked behind Jeffrey into his apartment. On the coffee table in the living room, the officer saw what were clearly pictures of dismembered body parts. The police immediately moved in and arrested Jeffrey. When his apartment was fully searched, a complete house of horrors was revealed. In addition to the photos of body parts, the apartment itself was littered with human remains. There were several human heads in the freezer and the refrigerator. In his bedroom, there was a massive 57-gallon drum containing more dead bodies that were decomposing in harsh chemicals. There was also undeniable evidence that suggested Jeffrey was eating his victims. Jeffrey lived in a crowded apartment complex, and other neighbors had complained about this awful putrid smell coming from his room. But he had been able to explain it away and convince everybody that his freezer had broken and it was just some bad meat. However, the most horrifying revelation about how Jeffrey was able to conceal these horrible crimes in the middle of a busy city apartment would come a few days later during the investigation. Apparently, 2 months before Gersie Edwards had run out of the apartment in handcuffs, another boy had managed to leave the apartment in handcuffs and was running down the road. Police officers stopped him, but the boy could not really speak. He was dazed, confused, and was not able to articulate why he was there or what he was doing. As the police were talking to him, Jeffrey came running up the road. He flagged the officers down, thanked them for finding his boyfriend, and said they had just gotten into a lover's quarrel and everything was fine now. And so the police shrugged it off. They said no problem, and they even gave Jeffrey and the boy a ride back to the apartment. They watched them go inside, and then the police left. But if the police had paid just a little bit more attention, they would have seen there was a small hole drilled in the back of the boy's head. Jeffrey had been pouring acid into this kid's head to try to control his mind, and that was why the boy could not speak. And as soon as the police let them go back into the apartment, Jeffrey killed the boy. It turns out that Jeffrey, Bridget's prom date, was none other than the infamous serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed 17 people over a 13-year period. Just days after the picture was taken of Jeffrey and Bridget standing on her lawn right before they headed off to the prom together, Jeffrey Dahmer would kill his very first victim and start his 13-year killing spree. Dahmer was ultimately given multiple life sentences, but in 1994, he was killed by another inmate while serving his time in prison. And so, while some monsters hide in the open in crowded apartment buildings, others seem to manifest in the absolute silence of the deep woods. Fast forward to January of 2004, where a 16-year-old girl named Misty Tasker was living a typical life as an American teenager in Live Oak, Florida. Live Oak is a very small, rural town right in the middle of the state, surrounded by dense forests and dirt roads. One Saturday evening in January, Misty and her mother attended a local church service. Afterwards, they hopped into her mother's pickup truck, got onto the country highway, and began making their way home. Their house was just a 20-minute drive down this highway. It was a straight shot, but this highway was incredibly desolate. There were no streetlights, and despite being called a highway, it was actually a dirt road. It was just thick, dark forest on both sides of the road the entire way, with no buildings or houses between the church and their neighborhood. Misty's mother was already a very anxious driver who would always keep both hands tightly on the steering wheel. She would sit up, hunch over the wheel, and keep her eyes intently focused on the road ahead. But at night, her driving anxiety would shoot through the roof because she had really bad eyesight, which made it difficult for her to judge distances in the dark. Because of this, she went to great lengths to never drive at night. But the church service they had just come from had run a little bit long, and so now Misty's mother was driving with the sun starting to set. She was going as fast as she could to try to get home before it got too dark. As they were bombing down this dirt road at about 55 miles per hour, despite it being a 40-mile-per-hour zone, Misty, who was in the passenger seat, just happened to look over at her mother for no particular reason. And as she was looking at her, she noticed out her mother's side window, it looked like there was a little girl sitting on the side of the road. Misty was confused. What would a young child be doing out here in the middle of nowhere? She turned to her mom and said, "Mom, I think I just saw a little girl." But her mother, who was high up on the wheel and completely focused on her stressful driving, did not hear Misty the first time. She was just staring at the road, trying to get them home. And so Misty said it again, louder. "Mom, I think I just saw a little girl. We need to go back." I don't know what she is doing out here, but I feel like we need to go back and make sure she is okay." Misty's mom looked over at her. She was not prepared to turn the car around. Turning around meant staying out later, and it meant she would have to drive in even darker conditions, which she absolutely hated. And so she looked at Misty and said, "Did you really see someone? Because we really need to get home." And Misty said, "Mom, I am pretty sure I saw a little girl. We have to go back." Finally, Misty's mother, though she was very annoyed, stopped the truck. She performed a careful three-point turn on the narrow dirt road and began driving back up the road towards where they had come from. They had only made it about half a mile from where Misty believed she had seen the girl. And so, pretty quickly, they slowed down because Misty said, "I think she is in this area." They both began scanning the right side of the road, which was where the girl would be now that they had turned around. It was starting to get very dark outside, but there was still enough light, and they had their headlights, so they were confident they would be able to spot her. As they were slow rolling down the road, they both saw the girl a little ways up on the right-hand side. Her back was completely turned to the road. She had her knees tucked up tightly to her chest, and she was slowly rocking back and forth in the dirt. Misty's mother made a comment that it was extremely surprising that this girl was out here. There was really nothing around. There were no houses, no buildings, and no trails to be walking on. It was just thick, overgrown forest on both sides of the road. She thought it was very strange that this girl would be out here, especially since there was absolutely no other traffic on this road. Misty's mother began slowly rolling the truck up to her. She told her daughter that instead of just stopping right away, they should drive past her first to get a good look at her, and then they would turn around and see if she needed any help. As they got right up next to her, they realized she was not a little girl. She was a young teenager, but definitely not a child. And as they drove right past her, they expected her to turn around and acknowledge the truck creeping up on her. After all, if you are sitting alone on the side of a deserted road in the dark and a large vehicle slowly rolls up next to you, you would naturally look to see who it is. But the girl did not acknowledge them at all. She did not look up. She just continued to keep her knees up to her chest, rocking slowly back and forth. Misty and her mother were a little bit freaked out by this behavior, but they stuck to their plan. They drove past her about 50 yards, and then Misty's mother did another three-point turn. When they turned around and looked back down the road, where the girl should now be on their left-hand side, they were oriented back towards their house. But when the headlights swept over the spot, she was not there anymore. It was now almost completely pitch dark outside, and all they had to light the area were the truck's headlights. Misty told her mom, "Drive up a little ways. Maybe she stood up and moved, and we just cannot see her because she is not in the path of the headlights." And so Misty's mom began driving slowly down the road, turning the truck slightly to the left to shine the headlights more into the trees on that side. But there was no sign of the girl. For good measure, they turned slightly to the right to shine the lights into the woods on the other side of the road, but there was still no sign of her. And so Misty and her mother just slow rolled back down the highway, keeping their eyes peeled on both sides. But after traveling for several minutes at about 5 miles per hour and seeing no sign of the girl, they decided that she must have just gone back into the woods and returned to wherever it was she came from. Misty's mom began picking up speed again, relieved to be on their way home. Before long, they had gone about 2 or 3 miles away from where they had seen the girl, and they were coming up to a 4-way intersection with stop signs all around. As they were getting close to the intersection, Misty's mother suddenly let out a gasp and slammed on the brakes. There, on the other side of the intersection, on the right-hand side of the road, was the exact same girl. She was sitting on the side of the road, her back to the highway, her knees pulled up to her chest, slowly rocking back and forth. Misty's mother pulled up to the stop sign and just sat there, the truck idling. Both women were completely stunned by what they were looking at. They had just seen this girl 2 or 3 miles back down the road. It was physically impossible for her to have traveled all the way up here on foot in the time it had taken them to drive. There was no way. Misty's mother looked at her daughter and whispered, "Do you think it is a different girl?" And Misty, shaking with fear, said, "No, Mom. That is the exact same girl. They just sat there in silence for a minute, the terror starting to sink in. Misty began to panic. She turned to her mom and pleaded, "Mom, don't stop. I have a really bad feeling about this girl. I don't know what is going on, but you cannot stop next to her. Just keep driving." But Misty's mom, although she was definitely weirded out by the situation, did not feel good about abandoning a young teenager in the middle of the night on the side of a highway. Even though she felt hesitant herself, she told Misty, "We have to at least drive past her and ask if she is okay. That is the least we can do." Misty was absolutely terrified now. She screamed, "Mom, do not stop! I have a bad feeling about this. Don't stop near her." But her mother let her foot off the brake and began to slow roll past the intersection towards the girl. At this point, Misty was in a state of pure panic. She took her seatbelt off, slid down off the passenger seat, and curled up in the footwell right in front of her seat. She closed her eyes tight, covered her ears with her hands, and continued to beg her mother to please just keep going and not stop. But her mother continued on until she brought the truck to a complete stop right next to the girl, who was still sitting there with her back to the road, her knees up, rocking back and forth. She still was not acknowledging the truck at all. Misty's mother turned to her daughter and said, "Please, roll down your window." But Misty refused. She stayed huddled in the footwell in the fetal position, crying and begging her mother to please just go home. Frustrated and scared, Misty's mother reached across the passenger seat, stretching over Misty, and grabbed the manual window crank. She began rolling the window down. Misty, who was lying in the footwell, remembers sitting there with her eyes closed, crying and covering her ears. She opened her eyes and looked up at her mother, who was leaning over the seat towards the open window. Her mother called out to the girl, asking if she was okay. And then Misty saw her mother suddenly recoil in absolute horror. Her mother let out a blood-curdling scream, threw the truck into drive, and slammed her foot on the gas pedal. They took off like crazy, flying down the dirt road. Misty jumped back up onto the passenger seat, looking at her mother in terror. She screamed, "What is happening?" "What just happened? What did you see?" Her mother had her hand pressed tightly over her mouth. She was speeding down the road, crying, and she was shaking so badly she could barely keep the truck on the road. She looked at Misty, but she seemed to have completely lost the ability to speak. Misty kept asking, "What did you see? What happened?" Finally, her mother managed to whisper, "She didn't have a face, Misty. She didn't have a face. It was just hollow. There was nothing on her face when she looked at me." Misty screamed, and both of them sobbed in terror as they sped the rest of the way home. They arrived at their house a couple of minutes later, running inside and practically falling over each other to lock the door behind them. As soon as they were safe inside, Misty's mom called 911. She did not even know how to describe what they had just seen. She knew it would sound completely crazy to tell the police that they had seen a faceless girl rocking by the highway. So she just told the dispatcher that they had seen a young girl on the side of the road who looked like she needed help. The police went out and searched that entire stretch of the highway, but they found absolutely nothing. There was no trace of anyone ever being out there, and the identity of the rocking girl remains a complete mystery to this day. And then, while some terrifying encounters seem to belong to the realm of the paranormal, others are the result of highly calculated human traps. Fast forward to the year 2018 in the state of Colorado. A 21-year-old brand new police officer named Derek was going through a very difficult time. He had recently been dumped by his longtime girlfriend, a breakup that had caught him completely by surprise. He had actually just recently moved all the way to Colorado specifically to be closer to her, so he was devastated and felt completely alone in a new place. After a few weeks of being deeply depressed, moping around, and just going through the motions of his daily routine, one of his close friends made a suggestion. He told Derek, "Hey, why don't you just make a profile on Tinder, the online dating app? Just put yourself out there again. You have no idea who is out there, and clearly, your ex-girlfriend was not the one for you." Derek had met his ex-girlfriend in a bar, and every other girlfriend he had ever had, he had met in person. Online dating was definitely not something he had ever considered. But he was incredibly lonely and sad, so he figured he had nothing to lose. He made himself a Tinder profile, and very quickly he matched with a woman named Leah. When Derek saw Leah's photos, he was amazed. He thought she was absolutely beautiful, way out of his league, but he certainly was not complaining. They began chatting on the app, and they got on great. They found themselves texting and talking on the phone constantly for a couple of weeks, and they decided they wanted to meet up in person. But the problem was, Leah lived well over an hour away from Derek, so there was no natural halfway meeting place. They went back and forth trying to figure out where they should go, and finally, Leah said, "Hey, why don't you just drive down to my town? There is this really great park that I go running in all the time. It has this awesome, massive field on a slope, and you can lay on a blanket and look up through the trees and see all the stars. Stargazing would be a really cool thing for us to do on our first date." Derek thought this sounded perfect. He was excited but also very nervous because this would be the first time they would see each other in person. The plan was for him to drive out to her town and pick her up directly from her workplace. She worked at a local hair salon and she would be finishing up her shift. Derek pulled up to the hair salon right as Leah was coming outside. She looked incredibly excited, waving to him as she ran over and jumped into the passenger seat. They hugged and kissed on the cheek, and Derek felt an instant connection. It was a strange feeling because they had talked so much online, so it felt like they had a history, yet they were still strangers meeting for the first time. But either way, Derek was really happy, and it seemed like Leah was too. From the hair salon, it was a pretty short drive to an access road that was supposed to bring them into the park. But when Leah told him to make the turn onto this road, Derek felt a little uneasy. It did not look like a well-marked trail or an entrance to a public park. It was a narrow, dark dirt road that looked like a random service trail. But he did not know the area, so he trusted her and turned the car down the road. The road quickly turned from paved to rough dirt, and as they drove deeper into the dark, Derek started thinking to himself, "Did I take a wrong turn? Does she actually know where she is going?" This did not feel like the entrance to a big public park. But then, they suddenly landed back on a paved road, and they were driving right next to a massive, beautiful open field. All of Derek's stress evaporated. He realized that even though the access road was weird, they were now in the right place, and everything was fine. Derek asked Leah where he should park. The road was very narrow, and there did not appear to be a parking lot or any other cars around. The field was completely empty and dark. Leah pointed ahead and said, "Just go right up there. There is a small dirt lot you can pull into." Derek started driving up the road, but as he looked ahead, he saw the dim headlights of another vehicle making its way down the hill towards them. It was dark enough that he could not make out what kind of vehicle it was. Because the road was so narrow, Derek decided to pull over as far to the shoulder as possible to allow the oncoming vehicle to pass them. Even though there was still a fair amount of distance between them, he figured he would just give them the right-of-way. As the vehicle got closer, Derek saw that it was a large, dark van. It was moving very slowly, and Derek just waited for it to pass. He did not think anything of it, assuming it was just another visitor leaving the park. But instead of passing them, the van suddenly turned at the last second. It pulled directly in front of Derek's car, stopping bumper to bumper, completely blocking him in. Derek's police training immediately kicked in. Even though he was a brand new officer, his instincts told him that this was a dangerous situation. Why would a vehicle block him in on a deserted road? Red flags went up instantly. He turned to Leah and said, "Stay here." He reached into the center console, grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight, jumped out of his car, and marched straight to the driver's side door of the van to confront the driver. When he shone his light inside, he saw a very large man who looked startled to see Derek charging up to his window. Derek tapped on the glass and demanded, "What are you doing, man? What are you blocking me in for?" The big man rolled down the window slightly and said, "Oh, hey, sorry about that. I am actually the caretaker here of this whole property. We have had a really big issue with illegal poachers in the area lately, and when I saw your car, I was concerned you guys were poachers. But now that I see you, it is clear you are not. I am really sorry." Derek looked at him, still suspicious, but he replied, "No, we are not poachers. We are just here on a date, going stargazing." The caretaker smiled and said, "I am so sorry to disturb you. Please, get back in your car and enjoy your night." At that, the man backed up, performed a three-point turn, and drove back up the hill, disappearing over the crest. Derek stood on the road for a couple of minutes to make sure the van was actually gone. Then he turned around, got back into his car, and tried to laugh it off with Leah. He said, "Yeah, he thought we were poachers. I guess you look like a pretty dangerous poacher to him." But when he looked over at Leah, she was not paying attention to him at all. She was staring at her lap, her fingers flying across her phone screen as she furiously typed a message. Derek thought this was a little bit odd. You would think she would be interested in the strange thing that had just happened, or want to know what the man had said. But she did not seem to care at all. She was completely absorbed in her phone. Derek shrugged it off, put the car in drive, and continued up the road. He pulled into the small dirt lot next to the field, turned his car around so it was facing the exit, and parked. He and Leah got out, laid a large blanket on the grass on the hill, and set out their food and wine. Very quickly, they started talking, laughing, and enjoying the night. For the next hour, everything was great. Derek lay on the blanket, looking up at the stars, feeling incredibly relaxed. But then, he noticed something to his left, up at the top of the hill where the van had disappeared. He saw headlights. It was the van again. But this time, it was not driving slowly. It was flying down the hill, accelerating rapidly, heading straight for the dirt lot. Before Derek or Leah could even react, the van roared into the parking lot, kicked up a cloud of dust, and slammed to a stop directly behind Derek's car, completely blocking him in. Derek and Leah jumped up. The driver's side door of the van swung open, and the caretaker hopped out. But this time, he was not acting friendly. He walked around the front of the van, and in his hand, he was carrying a heavy metal pipe. He looked at Derek and growled, "Give me your keys and your wallet right now." Derek, being a young, confident cop, was not about to let this guy rob him. He stood his ground, preparing for a fight. But then, he was hit with a massive curveball. Leah suddenly stepped away from him, ran over to the caretaker, and stood right next to him. She turned to Derek and said, "Come on, Derek. Give us your keys and your wallet." Derek stood there in absolute shock. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The entire date, the weeks of talking, the romantic stargazing spot, it had all been a trap. He had been set up by his date. He felt completely betrayed and sick to his stomach. As he stood there in silence, Leah walked to the back of the van, opened the doors, and pulled out another heavy metal pipe. She walked back to the front and said, "Derek, give us your keys and your wallet. We do not want to have to hurt you." Derek looked at the two of them, took a deep breath, and said, "No." The moment he said it, the big man lunged forward and tackled Derek to the ground. But Derek was a trained police officer, and he knew how to defend himself. He quickly overpowered the larger man, pushed him off, and scrambled back to his feet. He reached into his waistband, drew his concealed carry pistol, and pointed it directly at the big man, then quickly swept it toward Leah. He yelled, "I am a police officer! Get your hands up right now!" The moment they saw the gun, they both dropped their pipes and raised their hands, their faces filled with shock. Derek kept his weapon trained on them, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had to keep them at gunpoint while trying to call 911 on his phone. He dialed the number, and when the dispatcher answered, he tried to explain his situation and where he was. But because he was in a remote park in a town he did not know well, giving directions was incredibly difficult. As he was trying to explain to the dispatcher how to get to the lot, Leah and the caretaker looked at each other. Realizing his attention was split, they suddenly turned and bolted, running behind the van and sprinting into the dark woods. Instinctively, Derek took off running after them. He chased them into the tree line, but he had only been in the woods for about 30 seconds when he heard a sudden, loud sound. It was a gunshot. And then another. He saw the bright muzzle flashes coming from the darkness ahead of him. Someone in the woods was shooting at him. Derek realized he was completely exposed and had no cover, so he turned around and ran as fast as he could back to his car. He jumped inside, started the engine, and had to perform a frantic, desperate multi-point turn, smashing his car's rear bumper into the van and scraping against the fence over and over again before he was finally able to clear the obstacle and speed out of the parking lot. He drove as fast as he could down the road until he reached a brightly lit gas station. He called dispatch back, explained that he was safe, and asked them to send officers to his location. Within minutes, a police cruiser pulled into the gas station. 2 senior officers got out, and Derek explained the entire story to them. They were shocked by what had happened, and they decided they would all drive back up to the park together to investigate. When they arrived at the dirt lot, they saw the van was still parked there, completely empty. The 2 senior officers drew their weapons and carefully approached the vehicle while Derek stayed back. They searched the area, confirmed no one was around, and then began shining their flashlights inside the van. After a few minutes, they walked back to the cruiser. Derek could tell by the serious, pale looks on their faces that something was very wrong. One of the officers looked at him and said, "Derek, you are incredibly lucky to be alive. The back of that van is filled with knives, handsaws, pistols, rifles, bottles of lighter fluid, chains, handcuffs, and rolls of duct tape. And there are fresh bloodstains on the floor." The police launched a massive investigation. They went to the hair salon the next morning and spoke to the owner, showing them the photos of Leah. But the owner shook her head and said, "We have never had anyone named Leah work here, and we have never seen this girl in our lives." The entire thing had been a carefully planned, elaborate setup. The profile was fake, her job was a lie, and the romantic date was nothing more than a trap to lure him to a place where they could rob, torture, or murder him. The suspects were never identified or caught, and Derek deleted Tinder immediately, haunted by the realization of how close he had come to ending up in the back of that van. And so, while some predators use the promise of romance to lure their victims, others walk the crowded city streets, driven by dark impulses that they claim they cannot control, leaving a trail of grief behind them. This brings us to the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, in the winter of 1980. On New Year's Eve, the streets were filled with people celebrating the holiday. Among them was 20-year-old Karen Potak. She had been out at a bar with her friends, laughing and drinking, but as the night wore on, she decided she wanted to go home. She slipped out of the bar without telling her friends, stepping into the freezing cold night. The problem was, she had left her heavy winter coat inside. Shivering violently in her light dress, she began stumbling down the dark, icy streets, trying to find her way home. As she was walking, a car pulled up next to her. The driver, a polite-sounding man, offered to give her a ride home. Karen was cold, tired, and under the influence of alcohol, so she gratefully accepted and got into the passenger seat. A few hours later, at around 3 o'clock in the morning, the emergency police dispatcher received a telephone call. The caller's voice was frantic, high-pitched, and filled with tears. He sobbed into the receiver, "Please, this is an emergency. Send a squad to Pierce Butler Road near the Menberg Manufacturing Company machine shop. Send an ambulance too. There is a girl there." The dispatcher asked, "Can you tell me what happened to her?" The caller cried, "Just hurry! She is laying on the ground, in the back, by the railroad tracks." The dispatcher asked, "What is the address?" The man sobbed, "I don't know," and immediately hung up the phone. The police rushed to the industrial area behind the manufacturing building, and there, lying on the frozen ground in a pool of blood, they found Karen Potak. She had been brutally beaten over the head with a heavy tire iron and left to die in the freezing cold. Miraculously, she was still breathing. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors managed to save her life. But because of the severe head trauma she suffered, Karen had complete amnesia. She could not remember anything about the attack, the car, or the man who had picked her up. The police searched the area, but because of a fresh snowfall and the desolate location, there was no physical evidence. The case quickly went cold. Then, 5 months later, in May of 1981, the police received another chilling phone call. The dispatcher answered, and a weeping, emotional voice came through the line. The man was crying uncontrollably, saying, "Will you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody." The police did not connect this brief call to the attack on Karen Potak, and because the caller did not give a location, they did not know where to send help. But a few hours later, a group of teenagers walking through a wooded area near a highway in St. Paul found the dead body of 18-year-old Kimberly Compton. Kimberly had just arrived in the Twin Cities that very day, wanting to start a fresh, independent life. She had gotten off the bus, walked into a nearby diner, and was sitting alone when a friendly man approached her and asked to sit with her. When she told him she was new to the city, the man offered to drive her around and show her the sights. Kimberly accepted. Within 15 minutes of getting into his car, the man drove her to a secluded wooded area and stabbed her to death with an ice pick. 2 days after her body was found, the weepy-voiced killer called the police again, crying and confessing to the murder. He said he was sorry, that he did not know why he had to stab her, and that he would rather kill himself than go to prison. The police now knew they were dealing with a serial killer, but they had almost no clues. The diner staff could only provide a very general description of the man she had been sitting with, which could have fit anyone. The case went cold once again. 6 months later, in November of 1981, the phone at the police station rang again. The crying voice said, "Please don't talk, just listen. I am sorry. I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly Compton was the first one, but I don't know what is wrong with me. I am sick." The next day, a search crew found the body of 40-year-old Barbara Simons floating in the Mississippi River. She had been stabbed to death. The police discovered that on the night of her murder, she had been out at a local bar chatting and flirting with a man. Before leaving with him, she had jokingly told a waitress, "Boy, I hope he is nice because I am leaving with him." The waitress had a bad feeling about the man, so she made a conscious effort to get a really good look at his face. This intuition proved to be the break the police needed. When detectives interviewed the waitress, she gave them a detailed description, and when shown a book of mugshots, she immediately pointed to 38-year-old Paul Stefani. The police put Stefani under surveillance, but within 24 hours he managed to lose them. He drove into downtown Minneapolis, where he picked up 19-year-old Denise Williams. He took her down a dark alleyway where Denise sensed danger. When Paul pulled out an ice pick and lunged at her, Denise grabbed a glass bottle from the floor and smashed it over his head, cutting him deeply. She managed to escape and run for help, and a neighbor called 911. Paul fled the scene, bleeding heavily. Later that night, the weepy-voiced killer called for an ambulance, sobbing that he was badly cut up and bleeding from his head and arms. The dispatcher instantly recognized the high-pitched crying voice from the public recordings and sent both paramedics and police to the apartment. Paul Stefani was arrested in his hospital bed. He was convicted of the murder of Barbara Simons and the attempted murder of Denise Williams and sentenced to 58 years in prison. For 12 years, he maintained his innocence. But in 1997, after being diagnosed with terminal skin cancer, he decided to confess to all of his crimes. He admitted to the murders of Kimberly Compton and Barbara Simons, the attacks on Karen Potak and Denise Williams, and another unsolved murder, 33-year-old Kathleen Greening, who had been found drowned in her bathtub. He died of cancer shortly after, leaving behind a legacy of sorrow and unanswered questions for the families of his victims. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In the fall of 1985, a group of friends decided to spend their weekend hiking through the beautiful, rugged wilderness of the Angeles National Forest in Southern California. The air was cool, the leaves were changing color, and the trail they were following was peaceful and quiet. As they made their way down a long, winding dirt path, one of the hikers happened to glance off to the side, looking through the thick stand of pine trees and heavy brush that bordered the trail. Down in a small ravine running parallel to the path they were walking on, there was a small, shallow stream flowing gently over the rocks. The hiker stopped for a moment, scanning the water, when they noticed something that looked completely out of place. It was a dark, bulky shape lying in the middle of the shallow water, partially covered by the shadows of the overhanging branches and the surrounding foliage. The hiker pointed it out to the rest of the group, and they all stood there on the trail, trying to make out what it was. But from that distance, it was impossible to tell. Curious and feeling a strange sense of unease, the group decided to leave the main trail. They began to carefully make their way down the steep, slippery slope of the ravine, pushing aside the scratchy bushes and stepping over fallen logs. As they got close to a vatch of the stream, the shape in the water began to take a recognizable form. And when they finally stood right at the water's edge, looking down into the shallow flow, they completely froze. They just stood there in absolute stunned silence, staring at the horrific sight. It was the body of a young girl lying face down in the water, pinned beneath a massive, heavy log. The hikers were completely terrified and deeply shaken. They scrambled back up the ravine and ran down the trail to find help. It would take investigators another 3 long years before they would finally understand the dark, twisted, and incredibly sad story behind what those hikers had just stumbled upon in the stream that afternoon. To truly understand how this awful tragedy came to pass, we have to go back to the beginning, to the ordinary, everyday life of a 17-year-old girl named Michelle Avila. Now, almost everyone who knew her just called her Missy. In 1985, Missy was a high school junior living in the working-class community of Arleta, California, which is located in the San Fernando Valley just north of Los Angeles. Physically, young Missy was extremely small. She was under 5 feet tall, and she barely weighed 95 pounds. She had a very delicate, almost fragile frame, but despite her tiny size, Missy had an absolutely massive presence. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately brought a bright, positive energy with her. She was incredibly popular at her high school, and it was easy to see why. For one thing, she was exceptionally beautiful, with long, dark hair, striking features, and a radiant smile. Boys and girls alike were constantly falling over themselves to get her attention, to be near her, or to try and win her affection. But what really made Missy stand out was her genuine kindness. She was not stuck up or arrogant in the slightest. Instead, she was incredibly warm, gentle, and friendly to everyone she met. She did not take herself too seriously, she loved to laugh, and she was always willing to help out a classmate or a friend who was going through a tough time. To anyone looking in from the outside, Missy seemed to have a wonderful, perfect life with a loving family and a huge circle of friends who adored her. But, as is so often the case in true crime, behind this picture-perfect exterior, there were some very dark and troubling things going on. Life for Missy was actually far from perfect. It turns out that a year earlier, during her sophomore year of high school, a completely false and highly malicious rumor had started circulating around the school. This rumor claimed that Missy was secretly sleeping with a bunch of boys who were already in committed, established relationships with other girls at the school. It was a nasty piece of gossip, and it was a complete and total lie. Missy was a sweet, respectful girl who would never dream of doing something like that to anyone. But in the fragile social ecosystem of a high school, facts do not always matter. By the time this rumor made its way to the actual girlfriends of these boys, the damage was already done. These girls believed the rumor completely. They did not bother to ask Missy for her side of the story, nor did they look for any proof. They just wanted revenge. And so, one afternoon after school, as Missy walked out of the building and toward the parking lot, a group of these angry girls ambushed her. They ganged up on her, surrounded her, and began to beat her up. The attack was brutal and relentless. They knocked her to the ground, kicking and punching her, leaving her bruised, battered, and utterly terrified. Missy eventually managed to get away and make her way home, but when her family saw the state she was in, they were absolutely furious. Missy's mother Irene and the rest of the family immediately decided that they were not going to let this slide. They went straight to the police and pressed charges against the girl who had led the brutal attack, a teenager named Sonia Ballen. But pressing charges did not bring a swift resolution. The legal system moved incredibly slowly. The case dragged on for months and months, stretching through the rest of the school year and through the entire summer. But finally, as the school year started up again and Missy entered her junior year, a court date was set. By October 1st, 1985, Missy was just 1 week away from finally going to court, taking the witness stand, and testifying against Sonia Ballen. Naturally, Missy was extremely nervous about this. She was a 17-year-old girl who was going to have to face her attacker in a court of law and recount the terrifying beating she had endured. But deep down, she knew she was doing the right thing. She wanted justice, and she wanted to make sure that nothing like this ever happened to anyone else. On October 1st, which was a Tuesday, Missy came home from school just like she did any other day. She dropped her school books off, sat down with her mother Irene, and told her that she had plans that afternoon to go out and hang out with some of her friends. This was a very common, routine occurrence for Missy. She had a huge social circle, and she loved spending her free time socializing and being active. Her mother, Irene, did not see any issue with this. She just looked at Missy and told her that she could go, but she had to be back home by 6 o'clock sharp for dinner. Missy smiled, agreed to the curfew, and said she would be back on time. Just a few minutes later, a car pulled up on the street directly outside of Missy's house. Inside the car was 17-year-old Laura Doyle. Laura was one of Missy's very close friends, and she had driven over to pick Missy up so they could go hang out. Laura tapped on the horn to let Missy know she was there. Inside the house, Missy heard the honk, said a quick goodbye to her mother and her brother, ran out the front door, and walked down the pathway to the waiting car. She hopped into the passenger seat, closed the door, and the two girls drove away, chatting and laughing. Fast forward to 6 o'clock that evening. The sun was starting to set, and inside the Avila home, Irene was getting dinner ready. But as she looked at the clock, she noticed that Missy was not home yet. Now, Irene was not immediately plunged into a state of panic. While Missy was generally a very good kid who stayed out of major trouble, she was still a teenager. She loved being out with her friends, and from time to time, she would push the limits of her curfew. It was not uncommon for Missy to stay out past 6 and then walk through the door with a big smile, apologizing and asking for forgiveness. Or, sometimes, she would call her mother right around curfew time and ask if she could have just a little bit more time to hang out. So, when the phone inside the house started ringing shortly after 6 o'clock, Irene felt a wave of relief. She assumed it was Missy calling to apologize for being late or asking to stay out a bit longer. Irene walked over to the phone, picked up the receiver, and said hello. But the voice on the other end of the line was not Missy's. Instead, it was another young girl's voice, and it sounded incredibly strained and nervous. It was Laura Doyle, the girl who had picked Missy up earlier that afternoon. Before Irene could even ask Laura where Missy was, Laura spoke up in a very awkward, hesitant tone. She asked Irene if Missy was home yet. Irene was immediately confused by the question. She replied that Missy was not home, and then she said that she thought Missy was with her. After all, Laura had been the one to pick her up. Why would she be asking if Missy was home? As soon as Irene said this, Laura's tone shifted from awkward to sheer panic. She began to stammer, and then she proceeded to tell Irene a deeply concerning story about what had allegedly happened that afternoon. Laura claimed that after she picked Missy up from her house, the two of them had just driven around town for a while, listening to music and talking, which was a very normal thing for them to do. Eventually, they decided to drive over to Stonehurst Park, a local park where they and their friends frequently gathered to hang out. Laura said that she pulled her car into the Stonehurst Park parking lot and immediately started looking around to see if she could spot any vehicles belonging to people they knew. But as she scanned the parking lot, she did not recognize a single car. Figuring that none of their friends were there, Laura decided there was no point in staying, so she began to turn her car around to leave the park and head back into town. But as she was doing this, Missy suddenly grabbed her arm and told her to wait. Missy pointed out across the parking lot and said that she recognized some guys over there and she wanted to go over and say hello to them. Laura stopped her car and looked in the direction Missy was pointing. On the far side of the parking lot, standing next to a bright blue Chevrolet Camaro, were two guys who looked to be in their late teens or early 20s. Laura looked at them, but she did not recognize either of them. They were total strangers to her. Now, Laura explained to Irene that she was very used to Missy knowing absolutely everyone in town. Missy was so outgoing and popular that she seemed to have acquaintances everywhere they went. But Laura herself was not a very outgoing person, and she felt incredibly uncomfortable with the idea of going over and socializing with two older, strange guys she had never met before. But Missy was really eager to go say hello, and she begged Laura to let her go. So, according to Laura, she relented. She told Missy to go ahead and walk over to say hi, and said that she would find a parking spot, park the car, and then join her in a minute. Missy was thrilled. She hopped out of the passenger seat, closed the door, and began walking across the parking lot toward the blue Camaro, waving and smiling at the two guys who waved back at her. Meanwhile, Laura drove her car into a nearby parking stall. But just as she put the car in park and was preparing to turn off the engine, she happened to look down at her dashboard and noticed that her gas gauge was sitting well below empty. She realized she was practically running on fumes and might not even have enough gas to get home later. She rolled down her window and called out to Missy, who was about halfway across the parking lot by this point. Laura shouted that she needed to go run and get some gas right away, but that she would be right back to join them. Missy turned around, waved, and called back that it was fine, and told her she would see her when she got back. Laura said she put her car back in drive, pulled out of the parking space, and drove out of the Stonehurst Park lot, heading to a nearby gas station to fill up her tank. It only took her about 10 or 15 minutes to get the gas and drive back. But when Laura pulled her car back into the Stonehurst parking lot, she looked over toward the spot where the blue Camaro had been parked. The parking spot was completely empty. The blue Camaro, the two guys, and Missy were all gone. Laura sat in her car, staring at the empty space, feeling a mix of confusion and mild frustration. Since this was 1985, long before the era of cell phones, there was no way for Laura to call or text Missy to find out where she had gone. She couldn't ask if they had gone to get food or if the guys had offered her a ride somewhere else. Laura just sat there, trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, she convinced herself that everything was probably fine. Missy knew those guys, and Missy was smart. She could take care of herself. Surely, those guys would just drive Missy back home when she was ready to go. Even though Laura tried to reassure herself, she still felt uneasy. She decided to drive around the local area for a while, scanning the streets and other parking lots, hoping to spot the distinctive blue Camaro or see Missy walking along the sidewalk. But after driving around for quite some time and finding absolutely no sign of her friend, Laura finally gave up and went back to her own house. She waited until just after 6 o'clock to call Missy's house, knowing that Missy had a strict 6 o'clock curfew and would definitely be home by then if she had been dropped off. But now, speaking to Irene on the phone, Laura realized with horror that Missy had not made it home. Hearing this story, Irene was instantly gripped by a deep, unsettling anxiety. It was completely unlike Missy to just vanish like this, especially with two older guys that her close friend did not even know. But at this point, neither Irene nor Laura felt that they should involve the police just yet. After all, it had only been a short while since her curfew, and they did not want to cause a massive, unnecessary scene if Missy was simply running late or had lost track of time. Instead, Irene and Laura decided to take matters into their own hands. Over the next several hours, they sat by their phones, calling every single friend, classmate, and acquaintance they could think of, asking if anyone had seen Missy or if they knew who the guys with the blue Camaro might be. But person after person answered with the exact same response. They had not seen Missy all day, and they had no idea who those guys were. When phone calls yielded absolutely no results, Irene and Laura met up in person. Despite the darkness and the late hour, they began going door to door, visiting the homes of Missy's friends, knocking on doors, and pleading with anyone who answered for any shred of information. They walked the streets, calling out Missy's name into the night. But as the hours ticked by and midnight came and went, they had found absolutely nothing. No one had seen her, and no one knew where she was. Exhausted, utterly terrified, and completely out of options, Laura and Irene finally decided that there was nothing more they could do that night. They went back to their respective homes, hoping against hope that Missy would walk through the front door in the morning or that the phone would ring with good news. But the next morning, Wednesday, October 2nd, came and went, and there was still no sign of Missy. Her bed had not been slept in, and there was no word from her. Irene knew in her gut that something terrible had happened. She could not wait any longer. That morning, she went straight to the local police department and reported her 17-year-old daughter missing. The police immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. A young girl, just a week away from testifying in a high-profile assault case, had vanished without a trace. They immediately zeroed in on Laura Doyle, since she was the very last person known to have seen Missy alive. Detectives sat down with Laura and began grilling her, going over every single detail of her story. They pressed her for information about the blue Camaro. What year was it? Did it have any dents or custom features? What did the license plate look like? They asked her to describe the two guys in as much detail as possible. What were they wearing? How tall were they? What did their faces look like? Did Missy call them by their names? Laura was visibly distraught. She was crying, shaking, and completely consumed by guilt. She kept telling the detectives how incredibly sorry she was, sobbing that she never should have left Missy alone in that parking lot and that she should have just stayed instead of going to get gas. She tried her absolute best to answer all of their questions, but she explained that she had been quite far away from the guys and their car. She could only provide very basic, vague, physical descriptions. She said they looked like typical local teenagers or young adults, maybe with dark hair, but she couldn't give any specific facial features because she hadn't been paying close attention and was far away. Despite the lack of specific details, the police took the lead seriously. They launched a massive, coordinated search effort. Officers searched Stonehurst Park from top to bottom, looking for any tire tracks, dropped items, or witnesses who might have seen the blue Camaro. They set up checkpoints and began searching the surrounding neighborhoods of Arletta. At the same time, Missy's family, led by her devastated mother Irene, along with Laura and dozens of other volunteer friends and classmates, organized their own massive search parties. They printed out hundreds of flyers with Missy's picture on them and plastered them on utility poles, storefront windows, and car windshields all over the area. They walked through parks, searched vacant lots, and went down into local ravines, calling out Missy's name. But as Tuesday turned into Wednesday and Wednesday turned into Thursday, neither the official police search nor the desperate efforts of the volunteers turned up a single clue. There was no sign of Missy, no sign of the blue Camaro, and no one in the area recalled seeing two older guys fitting that description. It was as if Missy had simply evaporated into thin air. Then, on Friday, October 4th, just 3 days after Missy went missing, her body was found by those hikers in the Angeles National Forest. When the investigators arrived at the stream, they immediately secured the area and began a detailed search for any physical evidence. Just a short distance away from where Missy's body lay in the water, investigators found several discarded cigarette butts, an empty beer bottle, and a pair of men's denim overalls lying on the ground. In reality, these items had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. They had been left there days or even weeks before by random people who had visited the forest to hang out. But because of the incredibly detailed lie that Laura Doyle had told the police about the two older guys and the blue Camaro, these items seemed to perfectly fit her story. The detectives fell right into the trap. They assumed that the two mysterious guys from the park had taken Missy up into the mountains, hung out, smoked cigarettes, drank beer, and then for some unknown reason, murdered her. The police spent the next several months aggressively chasing down leads about blue Camaros in the San Fernando Valley, interviewing dozens of young men who owned similar cars, and trying to trace the origin of the overalls. But because the blue Camaro and the two guys were entirely fictional, the investigation went completely cold. For 3 long years, Missy's family lived in a state of agonizing limbo. They knew she was gone, but they had absolutely no idea who had killed her or why. The police had no solid suspects, and the trail had gone cold. But the absolute worst, most chilling part of this entire 3-year period is what one of Missy's childhood best friends, Karen Severson, did in the weeks and months immediately following the murder. Shortly after Missy's body was recovered and identified, Karen contacted Missy's grieving mother, Irene. Karen put on a masterful performance of pure, unadulterated grief. She fell to her knees, crying hysterically, and told Irene how completely devastated she was by the loss of her best friend. She claimed that she was too afraid and too sad to be alone in her own house, and she asked Irene if she could move into the Avila home. She said she wanted to help support the family during this unimaginably difficult time, and that being in Missy's house would help her feel close to her departed friend. Irene, who had known Karen since she was a little girl and viewed her almost as a second daughter, was deeply touched by this request. She welcomed Kinlist up to her home with open arms, thinking that having Missy's best friend around would help them grieve together and keep Missy's memory alive. For months, Karen Severson lived under the Avila roof. She slept in Missy's actual bed, surrounded by Missy's stuffed animals, her clothes, and her photos. She sat at the family dinner table every single night, eating the food that Irene lovingly prepared. She would sit next to Irene on the couch, comfortingly patting her hand as Irene wept over the loss of her daughter. Karen would even cry along with her, telling her how much she missed Missy and how unfair it was that someone had taken her life. But in reality, Karen's motivation for moving into the house was completely sinister and cold-blooded. She had not moved in out of grief or love. She had moved in to keep close tabs on the police investigation. She wanted to make sure she knew exactly what the detectives were doing, what clues they had, and if they were getting any closer to the truth. Whenever the police would visit the Avila home to give Irene an update on the case, Karen was always there. She would hover in the background, listening to every single detail the detectives shared. And whenever the conversation turned to potential suspects, Karen would actively manipulate the discussion to throw the police off her and Laura's trail. She would suggest other classmates at school, talk about how suspicious certain boys were, and constantly bring up the story of the blue Camaro, keeping the investigation thoroughly derailed. Karen even went so far as to spend hours in the car with Irene, driving around the streets of Arleta and the surrounding communities, pretending to search for any signs of the blue Camaro or the two mysterious guys. She watched Irene cry, she listened to her pour her heart out in absolute agony, and she offered her fake comfort, all while knowing that she was the very person who had held Missy's head under the water and ended her life. But while Karen seemed to have absolutely no conscience, the third girl who had been in the woods that day, 17-year-old Ava Sarambolo, was living in her own personal waking nightmare. For 3 long years, Eva carried the weight of the horrifying secret. She had not participated in the physical attack or the murder, but she had stood there and watched it happen, and she had done nothing to stop it. In the days immediately following the murder, Karen and Laura had cornered Eva. They looked her dead in the eye and delivered a chilling threat. If she ever spoke a single word to anyone, including her parents, her friends, or the police about what had happened in the woods, they would do the exact same thing to her. They told her that they would drag her up to the mountains, beat her, and drown her in the stream, just like they had done to Missy. Knowing what they were capable of, Eva believed them completely. She was absolutely terrified of Karen and Laura. She lived in constant, paralyzing fear that they would find out she had talked, or that they would decide to eliminate her anyway just to be safe. For 3 years, Eva's life fell apart. She couldn't sleep, her grades plummeted, she isolated herself from everyone, and she was constantly looking over her shoulder. Every time she closed eyes, she heard Missy's final, terrifying scream echoing through the trees. She saw the pain of Missy's family on the news, and the guilt began to eat her alive from the inside out. Finally, in 1988, the burden of the secret became too heavy for Eva to bear. She realized she couldn't live like this anymore. She decided that she had to face her fear, no matter the consequences. One afternoon, Eva walked into the local police station. She sat down with a detective, her hands shaking, and told them that she had information about the murder of Michelle Missy Avila. And then she proceeded to tell the detectives the entire shocking and detailed truth about what had actually happened on October 1st, 1985. The detectives listened in absolute stunned silence as Eva dismantled the 3-year-old mystery of the blue Camaro and the 2 older guys. She explained that the entire story was a complete fabrication and that Missy's 2 childhood best friends, Karen Severson and Laura Doyle, were the ones who had planned and executed her murder. The police acted immediately. They gathered their evidence, obtained arrest warrants, and went out to apprehend Karen and Laura. When the news of the arrests broke, Missy's family was completely shattered. Irene could not comprehend the sheer, unimaginable level of betrayal. The girl who had lived in her house, slept in her dead daughter's bed, eaten her food, and pretended to comfort her for months was actually her daughter's killer. It was a level of deception that seemed almost too evil to be real. During the high-profile trial that followed, the prosecution laid out the entire case using Eva's detailed eyewitness testimony to reconstruct the final hours of Missy's life. The defense tried to downplay their client's roles, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw the calculated nature of the rumors, the staged fight, and the brutal, prolonged method of the killing. Both Karen Severson and Laura Doyle were found guilty of second-degree murder. They were each sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Decades passed, and the girls who had committed such a heinous crime grew old behind bars. But eventually, the justice system deemed them fit for release. Karen Severson was granted parole and released from prison in December of 2011. Just a year later, in December of 2012, Laura Doyle was also paroled and walked free. Today, both women are out of prison, living their lives, while Missy Avila's life was permanently cut short at just 17 years old. The tragic story of Missy Avila remains one of the most chilling examples of jealousy, betrayal, and cold-blooded deception in the history of Southern California, leaving a lasting, painful, and deep emotional scar on her family, her loved ones, and the entire community of Arleta. But how did we get here? When Karen, Laura, and Missy were growing up, they were inseparable. They lived on the very same street in Arleta, California, which meant they spent virtually every waking hour of their childhood together, sharing jokes, playing in the street, and growing up side by side. They would walk to school side by side, share their lunch boxes, spend weekends at each other's houses, and talk for hours about their dreams for the future. They had built a deep, seemingly unbreakable bond that had survived the test of time through all the minor fights and disagreements that young kids typically have. But as they entered their teenage years and moved into high school, the dynamic between them began to change in a very subtle yet highly destructive way. Missy really blossomed during these teenage years. She grew into an exceptionally beautiful young woman with gorgeous dark hair, perfect skin, and a striking magnetic look that naturally drew people toward her. She was also incredibly popular at school, and she didn't have to try hard to make friends. People were just naturally drawn to her warmth, her gentle nature, and her easy laughter. But for Karen and Laura, the teenage years were much more difficult and painful. They both struggled deeply with their physical appearance and their social standing. Karen grew to be quite large, eventually weighing over 200 pounds, and she felt incredibly self-conscious and awkward in her own body. Laura also struggled with deep insecurities, feeling like she was plain, boring, and completely invisible whenever she stood next to her stunningly beautiful best friend. They began to notice that boys would only talk to them as a way to get closer to Missy. At parties, on the school bus, and in the hallways, Missy was always the center of attention, while Karen and Laura felt like they were nothing more than background props. Over time, as they watched Missy get all the attention, praise, and affection that they desperately craved for themselves, a dark, venomous jealousy began to fester deep inside of them. They started to resent Missy for simply being pretty and liked. And eventually, that resentment curdled into pure, unadulterated hatred. This hatred was what drove them to start that first highly malicious rumor during their sophomore year in 1984. They were the ones who whispered to other classmates that Missy was sleeping with guys who had established girlfriends. They wanted to see her get hurt, to see her cry, and to see her perfect reputation dragged through the mud. And they got exactly what they wanted when Sonia Bond and her group of friends ambushed Missy outside of school and beat her up so badly. But as the months went on, they realized that the beating hadn't actually ruined Missy's life. If anything, it had made people love and protect her even more. Missy's family had pressed charges, and Missy was now viewed as a brave, strong girl who was going to stand up in court and testify against her bullies. This filled Karen and Laura with absolute rage. They felt like Missy hadn't suffered enough, and they began to discuss a much more permanent and horrific solution. They decided that they were going to end her life. Their murder plot was meticulously thought out over several weeks. They knew they couldn't just attack her out of the blue because the police would immediately suspect them given their close connection. They needed a plan that would isolate Missy and lure her to a secluded location without raising any suspicion. So, they decided to start a second rumor. This rumor claimed that Missy was sleeping with boyfriends who belonged to Karen and Laura. They did this very intentionally, knowing that it would start a massive, explosive fight between the three of them. They wanted to create a highly public rift in their friendship so that everyone would see them fighting. And indeed, the rumor worked exactly as they had planned. It led to the screaming match where Karen slapped Missy in the face. This slap was a calculated move to draw a clear line of division between them. But then, they put the next phase of their plan into motion. They knew that Missy was an incredibly forgiving, sweet person who hated conflict and loved her friends deeply. They knew she would be devastated by the thought of her childhood friends hating her, and that she would do anything to fix the relationship. So, after letting the silence drag on for a couple of weeks, Laura approached Missy and pretended to be remorseful. She told Missy that she had realized the rumor was a lie, and she wanted them to be friends again. Missy was overjoyed and immediately forgave her. Then, on the morning of October 1st, Karen contacted Missy to deliver her own tearful, fabricated apology. She told Missy that she was so sorry for slapping her and that she missed her terribly. She suggested that they all meet up that afternoon at Stonehurst Park, just like the old times, to put the past behind them once and for all. Missy, completely blind to the danger she was in, was thrilled at the prospect of her friends loving her again. She agreed to the meeting without a single second of hesitation, utterly unaware that she was walking directly into a deadly trap planned by those she trusted most. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Barbara Rocky, 22, was sitting at her bedroom desk in Provo, Utah on the 11th of March, 1974. She was writing rapidly, almost angrily. She stopped, chewed her pen, and read her writing sometimes. It didn't satisfy her yet. She needed perfect words. She added a few lines, crossed off something, and reread it. Roommates were the recipients of her letter. Since this letter was her goodbye, it had to be perfect. Barbara was a junior at BYU, as everyone called it. BYU was religious. Most pupils were Mormons, but Barbara wasn't. She went to BYU because she was attracted by religion, not to practice it. She felt attending a faith-based school would be fascinating. But when she arrived, she realized her error. She felt absolutely out of place. Her classmates spent hours at church every week. They all observed stringent behavioral rules and principles. That didn't suit Barbara. Barbara, from California, was more free-spirited. She liked exploring new things and wasn't interested in rules. Barbara had been frustrated and alienated at BYU for 3 years. Her classmates didn't understand her, and she didn't either. She hoped her new home would alter things. 2 months earlier, in January, she moved with 7 other girls. It was evident by now that these girls didn't like her more than anyone else. They were pious, like the rest of BYU students, and thought Barbara was crazy. They didn't understand why she dated different individuals or tried different religions. They didn't get it. Barbara opted to lean into it, instead of trying to win her housemates over or change their thoughts about her. She acted out, intentionally making them uncomfortable. She told them she prayed to the devil, knowing they would be shocked. It works. They were stunned. Barbara began to feel that these females weren't as weirded out by her. They were suddenly terrified of her. That left Barbara feeling even more alone. Barbara was composing this letter at her desk for all those reasons. She informed her roommates that she would leave school temporarily. She needed people who understood her. She envisioned a small group of pals surrounding Richard Finder. Richard claimed telepathic powers. Barbara met him when she called a radio show where he gave paranormal readings. Something clicked between them immediately. Although Richard was almost a decade her senior, he appeared to understand Barbara better than anybody else. Since that phone conversation, their relationship was passionate. The atmosphere was beautiful and mystical. However, Richard lived far away, so most of their connection was over the phone. Barbara thought it would be wonderful to be closer to Richard and his open-minded pals. Barbara wanted to leave BYU for another reason, because she felt frightened as a young lady on a college campus. Recent national news headlines about college women being attacked were alarming. In January, a Washington State student was battered and nearly killed in her dorm room. Another campus girl disappeared the next month. Barbara was alarmed even though these attacks did not occur at BYU. It was especially uncomfortable because the targeted women resembled her. They had long, dark hair and similar faces. To protect herself, Barbara started judo courses at school. She even persuaded her best buddy, Jerry Hicker, to help her acquire a rifle for safety. The difficulty was that Barbara had lately lost her gun. She hadn't found it in weeks. She searched her room, car, and more. Although she reported it lost to campus police, she had no idea where it went. Barbara forgot about the lost gun for now. She breathed deeply and finished her goodbye letter. She then looked at her wall clock. Nearly 10 in the morning. She had class. She snatched the letter and put it in her purse. Her purse contained a turquoise necklace. Selling it that day was her plan. She would pawn her most treasured possession to earn seed money to leave town. Her destination would depend on how much money she could get. While packing to leave her room, Barbara heard a car pull into the driveway. I was relieved. She hoped her best buddy Jerry would return her car before class after borrowing it 2 days earlier to go skiing. He seemed to have arrived just in time. Barbara ran out her front door and saw her car, and Jerry leaping out of the driver's seat and waving her keys, shouting, "Hey, I'm back!" Jerry asked Barbara whether they were still going to hang out later that day as he returned the car keys. Barbara was busy. She was thinking about class and selling her necklace. She figured Salt Lake City had more pawn shops and paid higher than Provo. Driving north took less than an hour. After class, she could drive there since Jerry had dropped off her car. Barbara only nodded at Jerry's words, not paying attention. She snatched the keys, got in her car, and drove off. Barbara was still waiting for the teacher to dismiss her social work class over an hour later. She heard some pupils whispering behind her as she seated. She turned red, as they did, even though she couldn't understand them. Even if they weren't talking about her, it wouldn't have been the first. Her name was often mentioned at BYU. Barbara tried to ignore them. After the teacher let them leave, she sprang up, put her books in her bag, and ran out of the building. She swiftly walked to her car, got in, and drove away. She felt excited as she walked down the street toward the freeway. She couldn't wait to sell this necklace and leave. After 3 hours, Barbara's best friend Jerry went up the sidewalk to her house. He believed they would meet that afternoon, but Barbara never showed up. Barbara wouldn't skip plans without contacting. He was at her residence to check on her. Jerry realized her car wasn't in the driveway initially. He stood outside, contemplating whether to go inside and ask her roommates where she was. He decided against it. He knew they disliked him too. Instead, he turned around and returned home. He passed an apartment complex down the street from Barbara's house on his way back, stopping dead in his tracks because he saw Barbara's automobile in the lot. This was unusual. Jerry was confident she didn't know anyone in that building. Now worried about Barbara, Jerry went to her car to check it out. He looked in through the driver's side window and noticed a message on the passenger seat. He checked the door handle and found the car unlocked. He entered and grabbed the note. He started reading. He noticed his heart rate rise. Jerry ran into campus cops an hour later. Barbara's roommates trailed him. Jerry returned home to show Barbara's roommates the note he found in her car. He wanted to know if they had seen her since he was worried it was a suicide note. It appeared Barbara wrote the parting note. It indicated she was leaving for her people. The tone alarmed him. Jerry knew her roommates felt he was exaggerating. However, they agreed to accompany him to the police station to check on him. When the officer on duty came to the front desk, Jerry told him he had arrangements with Barbara that day and she hadn't shown up, which was unusual. He then detailed how he found her car in that unfamiliar parking lot, this letter, and his doubts about its meaning. The officer on duty said, "Okay, we'll look into it." Campus police did so for several hours. However, Barbara had not been seen or heard from since that morning. They contacted other campus students and her family. Realizing this could be a missing persons case, the police kept investigating. However, it was too soon to call it such. It was preliminary on the first day. The next day, a Utah utility worker hiked up a path in Big Cottonwood Canyon over 50 miles north of BYU, a steep nature preserve outside Salt Lake City. Officially, he was checking water lines, but he was also relaxing and enjoying the surroundings. Beautiful place. In the highlands, it was quiet and remote. When he reached the top of the trail and saw others, he was shocked. The woman was up there, but his brain initially processed what he saw as a woman lying on the ground, possibly nude. He initially thought, oh, she's sunbathing. That's what she's doing up here. But then he looked closer. He noticed March. It's cold. And she's face down. She is completely naked. He took a couple more steps forward and his brain finally understood what he saw. He gasped, turned around, and fled as fast as he could to his car to call the police. Captain Pete Hayward of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office drove his cruiser into Big Cottonwood Canyon via a remote access road within an hour. Hayward usually enjoyed nature. He spent his free time hunting and fishing. The lovely scenery and remote location were actually an annoyance right now. He needed to reach his objective quickly, but it was hard out here. Hayward had received a call about a utility worker finding a woman deceased in the canyon. A few first responders were already protecting the site, but Hayward knew they couldn't do much until he arrived. Because every murder case detail has to go via him. A few minutes later, Hayward observed police cruisers and a deputy at a trailhead ahead. He stopped, got out of his car, and followed the deputy up a steep trail for 300 yards. He was exhausted when he observed additional crime scene techs and officers around a bush. The body of a naked woman lay face down under the bush. Hayward approached and crouched over the body. He saw at least 3 bullet wounds in the woman's back immediately. No other injuries or decomposition were visible. He estimated that this woman had been here for a day, which was a miracle. Nobody visited this region this time of year. Without the utility worker, she may have gone missing for months. Hayward spotted the woman's clothes and shoes next to the body. Each item was nicely folded, which surprised him. Hayward donned latex gloves and examined the outfit. Nothing was ripped or destroyed, he saw. Hayward also remarked that the scene was as immaculate as the garments as he strolled about. No firearms was visible. No dirt marks indicated a struggle or brawl. The body showed no signs of being dragged. Hayward believed this woman was shot and died where she was found. Hayward surveyed the trail from the middle. Those nicely folded clothing could signify several things. A consenting intercourse that went violent may have erased them. The woman may have been gunned down. Hayward felt this woman's killer was someone she knew. Because getting here from the road was hard. Hayward was approaching 50 and wasn't in great shape, but even a young and fit person would struggle to force another up a steep slope like this. It made more logical that she had walked up here freely with a trusted person. After they got up here, that individual killed her without witnesses. Hayward believed his theory wasn't much until he identified this woman. It appeared she had no handbag and no ID in her folded clothes. Hayward signaled other police to help him flip her body to see below. Hayward noticed a few bullets on the dirt as they did it. The rear images showed they had gone straight through her. Hayward directed his team to photograph and bag the rounds for testing immediately. He also directed them to get some of the ground where the bullets were lodged in case it contained more evidence. In the 1970s, investigators could test garment fibers or hairs for a suspect without DNA. After giving his crew directions, Hayward breathed deeply and returned down the trail. He had to find her name. Next Wednesday, March 13, Hayward hurried down a Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office hallway to a meeting room. He was bleary-eyed and adrenaline-fueled after working this case constantly since the day before. He had just met with the ballistics expert who told him the gun that killed this woman was likely .357 caliber. Of course, this was useful for the investigation. Since .357s were plentiful, it didn't narrow things down. Hayward found something else important for the investigation. Victim's identity. Barbara Rocky was 22. Hayward's team aired the body's finding on local news the night before. After releasing that, BYU police called regarding a student who had gone missing a day earlier. Some of this missing student's friends had come to Salt Lake City to identify the deceased a few hours earlier and confirmed that it was Barbara. Hayward had previously spoken to some of the youngsters and had other officers contact Barbara's relatives. But Hayward was on his way to receive a formal statement from a young guy called Jerry Hicker. Jerry was one of the body's identifiers and reported Barbara missing initially. Hayward hoped he might help them find Barbara's killer. Hayward sat across from Jerry at a conference table minutes later. Jerry appeared rattled. He kept shaking his head and turning away, like he was trying not to cry. Hayward was a harsh interrogator. Given Jerry's clear guilt, he didn't spend time giving condolences or Kleenex. According to Barbara, he was her best school friend. Hayward believed Barbara was murdered by a trusted person. So he plainly told Jerry that he needed to know everything that transpired the day Barbara disappeared. Jerry was surprised by the bluntness. However, he took a hesitant breath and claimed that he had taken Barbara's automobile the day before and returned it at her house around 10 a.m. on Monday. He then said he spent several hours in the library. He said he'd meet Barbara. Barbara didn't show up for their later-day hangout. He found her car gone when he checked on her at home. He started walking home again when he saw her car down the block, parked outside an apartment complex he didn't understand. His assumption was that she didn't know anyone there. He stated he was walking to the car and spotted a message inside. Doorknob was open when he tried. He took the note from within and read it. He stated the note was unsettling. He suspected a suicide note. Hayward nods. He noticed the note. BYU police gave it to him. Excerpt, Barbara seemed to be informing her housemates she was leaving town to be with like-minded people. The note was cryptic, so Hayward wasn't sure what to make of it. A suicide note or a regular note could be it. He wasn't even convinced Barbara wrote the letter. Her killer may have authored the letter. Barbara's murderer may have tried to make her absence look like a suicide or a runaway in hopes that police would never uncover her body. Hayward forwarded the letter to a handwriting expert for feedback. Hayward asked Jerry about Barbara. Jerry claimed that they hung out a lot and that she gravitated toward him because she felt unwelcome at school and with her housemates, who didn't like her since she wasn't religious. Jerry also told Hayward that Barbara had exacerbated her roommates' disagreement by shouting sacrilegious things to frighten them. He said there was so much tension between them that he tried to find Barbara a new place to live. This cheered Hayward. The possibility of Barbara's domestic struggle seemed intriguing. Even though a group of young, devout Mormon ladies were unlikely murder suspects, it was worth investigating. One of them may have snapped and tried to injure Barbara after being scared by her mocking. Hayward stood up and informed Jerry he could leave because he had no more questions. He wasn't ready to rule out anyone, but Jerry seemed doubtful. He reported Barbara missing and had an alibi for sections of the day. Given that her body was recovered in a remote region by chance, the killer would have been better off keeping quiet and hoping it was never found. Why would Jerry call the police if he was the killer? It was illogical. Hayward left to hassle officers. They needed to speak with Barbara's roommates in Provo. 2 days after Barbara's death was located in the canyon, Hayward drove to a Salt Lake City pawn shop the next afternoon. Because so much had transpired in the last 24 hours, he was exhausted even more than yesterday. They contacted Barbara's relatives, who were upset, but they had no useful information for the investigation. They didn't know Barbara's friends or school life, so they couldn't say if somebody wanted to hurt her. No one knew if she planned to leave campus. Apparently, she was, since the handwriting expert returned to verify the note. Written by Barbara. If read literally, the note was about her true plans to depart. Hayward thought the letter from Barbara should be interpreted literally after speaking to Jerry, who had talked about the tension between Barbara and her roommates and how she didn't fit in, and after speaking to all 7 of Barbara's roommates, who all admitted they didn't like Barbara. She only wanted to leave university and her roommates. But the roommates had good explanations for Barbara's disappearance. Hayward had to eliminate the housemates for now. Hayward was unconcerned since the roommates had given him another lead. One roommate said Barbara wanted to pawn her Salt Lake City turquoise necklace before she left. Hayward and other cops spent the day searching local pawn shops to discover if she had done it. Hayward hadn't located the necklace or Barbara's pawn store yet. But aside from this jewelry lead, the investigation was losing pace, so he felt hopeful, maybe too hopeful. They had searched and fingerprinted Barbara's car, but discovered nothing substantial. The returned autopsy was basically useless. The medical examiner found 5 gunshot wounds, more than Hayward expected. But they couldn't confirm Barbara's sexual assault. The forensics analysis showed no fingerprints from the crime scene. Hayward entered this pawn store with all of this in his brain. He asked the cashier if she bought a turquoise necklace. To Hayward's surprise, the woman answered, yes. She then pointed to a glass case behind the counter where a long white necklace with turquoise stones was sitting on a red felt pad. After 30 minutes, Hayward was back in his cruiser, his heart racing and his mind running so quickly he couldn't focus. Because Hayward finally had a trail. Barbara fit the shop clerk's description of the turquoise necklace seller. Additionally, the shopkeeper had a sale ticket showing Barbara was at the store on March 11th at 12:50 p.m., the day she disappeared. The most amazing part of this fresh lead was that Barbara informed this clerk she was in a hurry because her lover was circling the block outside. This was significant because Hayward and his crew had interviewed many people in Barbara's life, and none had indicated a lover. Unfortunately, the pawnshop worker had not seen Barbara's boyfriend. After taking the necklace and receipt as evidence, Hayward rushed back to the precinct to make calls. He wanted to know if Barbara's friends knew about this boyfriend but hadn't said it. A deputy stopped Hayward when he parked his car and ran into the precinct. The deputy seemed as excited and stressed as Hayward. The deputy told Hayward he wouldn't believe this, but they were continuing their background interviews, and Barbara's acquaintances indicated she had mentioned Richard, her lover. This was excellent for Hayward. Exactly this information was his goal. The deputy was upset because she had a boyfriend, not this. He said Richard was Richard Finder, a California psychic who was in town on a ski holiday when Barbara was killed. They knew that because Richard had called the station unexpectedly to offer help. A few hours later, Hayward sat across from 30-year-old Richard Finder in interrogation. Richard, with spectacles and a goatee, appeared confident and eager to help. Hayward felt like he was acting. He believed Richard killed Barbara. After all, murderers often entered murder investigations to see what was going on and divert culpability. Hayward believed Richard was ringing in to offer his psychic skills. Hayward had spent the last 2 hours investigating Richard. He also found his .357 pistol, which killed Barbara. He also discovered that Richard was staying in Salt Lake City near Barbara's body in Big Cottonwood Canyon. Way too many coincidences. Hayward was ready to be brutal with Richard to get a confession. But Hayward answered some background questions first. Richard revealed that Barbara met him after hearing him on the radio. He said they'd never been physical but had a profound spiritual relationship. After that, Hayward directly asked Richard why he contacted the station. Richard became serious and stated he needed to come forward because he had a sense about Barbara's fate. He said he was a psychic and had a vision that the murder weapon was tossed in water. Hayward couldn't believe his ears. Since the cops hadn't reported the murder weapon missing, he knew they were hunting for the murder weapon, but Richard shouldn't have. Thus, Hayward did not inquire further regarding his vision. Instead, he asked that Richard account for every hour of his day on March 11, Barbara's disappearance. Richard seemed truly confused for the first time. He glanced at Hayward in disbelief. Afterward, he denied killing Barbara. "Not possible," he said. He spent all day with buddies. Hayward frowned at Richard and handed him a pad of paper to write down his friend's information for follow-up. As he watched Richard quickly write down names and numbers, Hayward knew this was their guy. The circumstantial evidence against him was overwhelming. He understood they needed more evidence to arrest. Thus, Hayward would first verify Richard's alibi and then test his .357 against Barbara's murder bullets. So he informed Richard he could go for now, but they needed to check his gun. A few weeks later, Hayward sat at his sheriff's office desk staring at Richard's gun ballistics. Barbara was slain by something other than a gun. Hayward couldn't recall being more startled and disappointed. He identified Richard as the killer. Richard, his sole suspect, was great. After checking his alibi, it didn't hold up. His pals answered, "Well, we were with him, but not the whole day. So Richard was missing for major parts of the day she went missing." Hayward grumbled and reminded himself that Richard wasn't innocent just because his gun wasn't a match. It's conceivable he used another .357 and then abandoned it. However, Hayward couldn't believe they were starting over. Having done what he could, he felt done. He spoke to necessary parties. After analyzing their proof, he had nothing. Hayward had experience resolving cases and satisfying families. Now he worried he couldn't do it for the Rocky family. Hayward continued investigating this case for months and years, but the leads dwindled. Finally, he was promoted. He soon got involved in additional cases. Finally, Barbara's case stalled. 3 decades after Barbara's death, Salt Lake City Sheriff's Department Detective Todd Park sat on the floor behind his desk in the fall of 2005. Crime scene images, interview transcripts, and evidence logs from Barbara Rocky's 1,974 murder investigation filled his floor. Park, a new homicide detective, took up this case after Barbara's sister called to ask the sheriff's office to reopen it. Park wasn't sure if it was new guy enthusiasm, but he was preoccupied with solving it. He wanted to discover answers for the Rocky family, who had been wondering about Barbara for over 2 decades. Park seemed really optimistic. Even if they hadn't used DNA testing in the first investigation, they couldn't conduct it then. However, the detectives had done a rape kit and carefully stored all the evidence, including Barbara's clothes and the soil under her body. With DNA technology breakthroughs, they could probably address this. Park had sent several evidence locker items to the lab for testing. He reviewed the case data to gain a sense of how it was probed in 1974 while waiting for the results. He found a peculiar case. The murder was initially suspected as being personal. Police considered the possibility that Ted Bundy killed Barbara even though the case was cold. That this wasn't personal and she was one of his many victims. In 1975, 1 year after Barbara's death, Ted Bundy was caught less than an hour from her Salt Lake City home. He had been killing college women across the West Coast, including several in Utah the year Barbara was killed. In the late 1970s, investigators ruled Ted Bundy out since he was conducting a different murder in Washington state at the same time Barbara was killed. Barbara could have been slain by another local serial killer. Because of the number of U.S. killers in 1974, it was called the Year of Fear. Park eventually agreed with the first investigator that Barbara's murder was personal after reading the notes. Even the amount of times Barbara was shot looked emotional. Park thought Barbara's boyfriend, Richard Finder, was the killer. After all, Richard was nearby during the murder. His alibi was non-existent. He mentioned the missing murder weapon while the public didn't know. Thus, he learned inappropriate crime scene details. Park thought some people, including Barbara's best friend, Jerry Hicker, deserved a second look. He had an alibi, and Barbara had told the pawnshop owner before she was killed that she was with her boyfriend, not Jerry. If Park was right about this being an emotional crime, Jerry had to be considered. He was Barbara's best buddy in school, so maybe he was furious when she left town. Next, Barbara's housemates. They all had good explanations, but one may have hired someone to assassinate Barbara. Park was aware that the original detectives hadn't discovered any proof, but they hadn't spent much time with the roommates either. They promptly disqualified them. Park also realized it could be someone they hadn't considered, like the utility guy who found the body, or a BYU student who didn't like Barbara and thought she was eccentric. Park wasn't sure, but he was confident they'd find DNA in all that old evidence. They'd discover their killer, then. 2 years later, Park paced his office on an October 2007 afternoon. He occasionally glanced at his desk phone. Each minute he waited for a lab call increased his anxiety. Park's reinvestigation of Barbara's murder had reached a dead end with DNA testing. Over 2 years, the medical lab examined practically every item from Barbara's case, including her rape kit swabs and clothes. They couldn't acquire DNA from anything. It either didn't exist or was too old and poorly preserved. Nothing was left to test but the dirt the original investigators retrieved from Barbara's body. Park first didn't send in the dirt because he didn't think it had DNA. He now had only this evidence. When the lab called this time, Park knew he'd either learn the killer's name or his case would be ended. Eventually, Park's phone rang. He grabbed it and got a dry mouth as he heard the lab on the other end. Before Park asked, they told him they had a profile. That dirt sample from Barbara's body included DNA years earlier. Park found a name by running that DNA profile through their criminal database. Reconstructed from DNA evidence and decades of investigation, this is what police believe happened to Barbara Rocky on the 11th of March, 1974. The killer saw Barbara's car come up to the sidewalk before noon. The killer jumped inside and smiled at Barbara, who smiled back. As Barbara requested, they drove to the Salt Lake City pawn store. When they arrived, Barbara stepped out of the car and entered. After she entered, the killer took the driver's seat. They would drive the car from then on. Their heart raced as the killer waited for Barbara in the driver's seat. They couldn't wait for her to return outside and get in the car because the killer loved her. They decided to make their connection physical today. When Barbara returned outside and jumped into the passenger seat after selling her jewelry, the killer joyfully stated, "Hey, there's some trails nearby. Why don't we go for a hike?" Barbara paused, like she didn't want to do this. But the killer knew Barbara was leaving Utah. They knew she wrote a goodbye note and sold the necklace to go permanently. They guilt-tripped her. They said, "Look, let's just go enjoy the beautiful countryside before you leave town." Barbara shrugged and said, "Okay, fine." The killer joyfully went to the canyon and parked near a picnic area. Then they stepped out and started walking toward a trail, and the killer touched the outside of their pocket to make sure the gun they stole from Barbara was still there. They didn't know if they'd use the gun, but they wanted to make sure it was ready. While hiking this trail, the killer and Barbara chatted, made their way up, and enjoyed the sights. But eventually, the killer couldn't wait. They had to act. They stopped Barbara. The killer stepped forward and made their move after checking for others. Their touch on Barbara was plainly amorous. However, Barbara recoiled and stepped back, telling the killer she didn't want it. This enraged the killer immediately. The killer approached her again and saw Barbara's terrified expression, which made them even angrier. After aiming Barbara's gun at her, they urged her to take off her clothes. Barbara was shocked, but she obeyed. She deliberately took her time. She carefully folded each garment while pleading with the killer not to do so. She pleaded with the killer after taking off her clothing and stacking them close to her. Though ashamed and outraged, the killer decided enough was enough. Barbara was shot in the chest. She collapsed. They fired more recklessly until Barbara stopped. The killer panicked and rushed down the trail to Barbara's car once Barbara was dead or dying. They got in and went to Provo and BYU. However, they stopped and left Barbara's pocketbook and revolver. When they arrived in Provo, they parked Barbara's car down the road near that other apartment complex so the killer wouldn't see them. They fled, leaving Barbara's message in the car. Barbara's note were not suicide notes. Her parting note to her roommates was literal. However, the killer thought it was a suicide letter. If they left it there, when they returned and found the letter in the car, they could inform the police Barbara may have killed herself. Hopefully, it would steer the cops away from the killer. Jerry Hicker, Barbara's best friend, killed her. Jerry's cooperation and fact that he reported her missing led the first detectives to not suspect him. After he admitted to violence, they were suspicious. He was involved in other university rapes the year after killing Barbara. They didn't have enough evidence to arrest until decades later when the lab recovered DNA in 1974 crime scene dirt. They matched that profile to Jerry's DNA from another unrelated incident. Jerry killed Barbara with her gun, which he helped her buy to defend herself from killers like him. Jerry was dying of cancer when arrested in 2007. He confessed to Barbara's murder for a lesser sentence and served 5 years. His death occurred in 2014. Many thanks for viewing. Comment your thoughts about today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. Many scary movies are set in the woods for a good reason. Consider it. The woods are naturally scary at night. More specifically, most of those films take place in a cabin in the woods at night. Being in the deep woods at night as humans ticks many fear boxes. The isolation factor comes first. We're scared because you're far from society and help. Isolation makes us more vulnerable, so we avoid it. Naturally, it checks darkness, fear. Humans fear the dark because they don't know what's around them or looking at them. City lights don't help in the forest. You are in complete darkness due to light pollution cancellation. That something can easily hide in the forest is the third fear check. You don't know what's watching because of all the trees. At every turn, predators, animals, or even predatory humans could hide behind any trunk. Hollywood has made countless movies using the cabin in the woods trope of isolation and fear because it works. We fear it deeply. Today's cabin in the woods story begins like many others, but it's different. True story, I was terrified. As I read about what happened in this cabin in the woods, I tried to imagine what this young man would go through psychologically. My horrific cabin in the woods experience haunts me to this day. I could relate to this guy because I've been there, and the details of the story are terrifying. Try to imagine his situation as you listen to today's story. Consider your response to this situation. A 17-year-old boy was devastated when his father died suddenly in 2010. The whole family was shaken by this loss. They were grieving a husband and father, but also because their daily lives revolved around each other. This close family did almost everything together. They spent weekends and vacations together and had a strong bond that kept them together through every challenge. A special bond existed between the boy and his father. They were best friends, not just father and son. His father loved the outdoors and spent years teaching him to fish, hunt, and navigate the wilderness. They had spent hours together discussing life and planning for the future. Father had big dreams for his son, who looked up to him above all else. My dad never missed a game, always offered advice, and made his family feel safe no matter what was going on. Tearful faces, handshakes, and whispers of sympathy filled the funeral. People kept telling the boy that his father was in a better place and that he needed to support his mother and younger siblings. Strength was harder to achieve. The boy stopped going to school sports practices, and his grades started to drop because he could not focus on anything other than his massive void. He sat in his room at night, staring at his father's old hunting boots and favorite fishing rods, wishing for one more conversation. When his father died unexpectedly, the boy felt like his world had collapsed. The silence in their home and grief were almost unbearable. One of their favorite family activities was spending time at their cabin. This cabin was near Mount Bachelor, Oregon. Snowboarders, skiers, and winter enthusiasts visit Mount Bachelor, a beautiful mountain. Years earlier, the family built this cabin there and spent a lot of time there in winter. The family would go up, sit by the fireplace, ski during the day, and enjoy being away from the world. It was their favorite getaway. They could escape school, work, and normal life and focus on family. The father worked hard to build and maintain the cabin, and his style was evident everywhere. He had hand-carved wooden shelves, photos of their fishing trips on the walls, and a cozy, warm atmosphere he worked hard to create. During winter trips, his father taught him how to chop firewood, build a nighttime fire, and respect the wilderness. He told him the forest was beautiful, but that nature did not care about you, so you had to be aware. The boy felt confident and capable in the woods because of those lessons. After the father died, the family had to settle his estate. Any family finds this difficult, but theirs was especially difficult because every possession, room, and memory brought back their loss. They discussed the cabin while deciding what to do with everything. This place that brought them so much joy and happiness felt hollow suddenly. I had many fond memories there, but now it reminded me of who was missing. They realized life without him would be different. The laughter, shared meals, and fireplace warmth felt like a past they could never return to. The mother realized that returning to the cabin would be too painful and that she could not handle being there without her husband. After much crying and discussion, they decided to sell the cabin because going back there as a family was too painful. It upset the 17-year-old boy to hear this decision. He was close to his father and had many fond memories of hunting, skiing, and snowboarding at that cabin. Long car rides up the mountain, early mornings drinking hot chocolate by the stove, and quiet walks through the snowy pine trees came to mind. He saw the cabin as more than property. It felt like his father was there, a physical connection to his memory. The boy asked his mother for a favor after she listed the cabin for sale. Before the cabin was sold to a stranger and permanently removed from their lives, he asked to spend some time alone there. He wanted to honor his father. He wanted one last chance to sit there, remember the good times, and say goodbye. Mom understood completely. She wanted her son closure because she saw his pain. She advised him to proceed. She told him he could stay at the cabin as long as he wanted, but when he returned, they would close the sale and the property would be gone forever. Before his death, his father left his car to him. Receiving his father's well-maintained car was bittersweet for the 17-year-old. The boy decided to drive his father's car to the mountain. He saw it as another way to connect with his father. He went to the grocery store and bought his favorite snacks, sodas, and drinks for a few days. He bought everything he needed to avoid leaving the cabin once he arrived. He piled everything into the car. His bags contained warm clothes, snowboarding gear, and a video game console. Most importantly, he brought Midnight, the family black dog. The boy thought having Midnight, a loyal, friendly dog who was close to his father, would make the quiet cabin feel less lonely. The plan was simple. They would relax at this remote Oregon cabin after he drove there with Midnight. He wanted to enjoy the space one last time and make one last good memory before the property was sold and they moved on. He was determined to have a good trip so he wouldn't remember the cabin negatively. After packing, he put Midnight in the passenger seat and drove up the mountain. While listening to his father's favorite music on the radio, he saw the familiar scenery as the city faded and Oregon's dense forest took over. The drive was long and quiet, and as he climbed higher into the mountains, the pine trees grew taller and denser, forming a dark, silent wall. He felt comforted and sad by his father's car's old leather seats and engine hum, which reminded him of their past trips. He parked the car in the small gravel driveway to the cabin and inhaled. Mount Bachelor's wilderness was wild and unforgiving despite its rugged beauty. The mountain was covered in dense Douglas fir, hemlock, and pine forests. Black bears, cougars, and elk roamed these forests. The boy drove up the mountain road, keeping an eye on the thick tree line because he knew a wild animal could appear from the brush at any time. The roadside snow was high, and as he drove up, he felt like he was entering a different world, far from modern safety. His father's car's old engine roared as it climbed steep, icy hills, and the heater struggled to keep the cabin warm in the cold mountain air. He felt vulnerable, but also excited, believing that the mountain's cold and silence would help him regain his strength. To understand what happens next, we must discuss the cabin's layout. It was a two-story mountainside building. The back half of the cabin had no windows except for one tiny narrow one because it was built against the steep mountain slope. Back of the house's first floor bathroom had this tiny window. This design was practical for insulation and stability against the mountain, but it closed off the back of the house from the outside, creating a blind spot. Unless you were looking through that tiny bathroom window, you would not see someone approaching the cabin from the mountain behind it. However, the cabin front was lovely. Large windows lined both floors of its double-decker design. Second-floor windows looked out from the master bedroom loft. A wooden balcony jutted out a few feet from the master bedroom. Large glass windows next to the front door let you see into the living room and kitchen on the first floor. The back of the house was dark and closed off, but the front was open to the wilderness. The cabin was built in dense forest. Years ago, the family had to clear out many trees to build the cabin's foundation. However, they only cleared a small area in front of the house for a driveway and yard. The cabin was still surrounded by massive pine trees on all sides and back. This meant the cabin was in a tiny clearing surrounded by a dark forest wall. Looking out the window and over the balcony from the second-floor master bedroom, you could see the tree line about 100 yards away across this small clearing. The family left a few large trees in that clearing. A unique tree was here. A massive, heavy branch grew 20 feet above the ground, parallel to the ground. This thick, flat branch looked like a natural bench or seat, perfect for multiple people to sit. But it was 20 feet up and had no lower branches, making it difficult to climb. Nobody ever tried to climb the sitting tree, which stood in the middle of the clearing with its natural seat branch facing the cabin's front windows. After arriving at the cabin, the boy parked the car in the snowy driveway and turned off the engine. He sat contemplating the familiar wooden structure, feeling sad and comforted. Crisp, cold air, and absolute forest silence. He began unloading the car. He took his grocery bags from the trunk and brought them inside. He turned on the heater to warm the wooden rooms in the cold cabin. In the kitchen, he opened the refrigerator and put his sodas and drinks on the shelves. He arranged his snacks on the kitchen counter. He then carried his clothes and PlayStation up the wooden stairs to the second floor. He connected his video game console to the master bedroom loft's TV's back. Midnight was happily sniffing the house and wagging her tail downstairs. Her presence immediately warmed up the quiet cabin because she seemed to remember it. First 2 days of stay went as planned. Besides playing video games and eating snacks, the boy occasionally left the cabin to snowboard on Mount Bachelor. The slopes were great, the snow was fresh, and he felt peaceful in the mountains. Back at the cabin, he felt close to his father. He sat in his father's favorite chair, looked out the large front windows, and recalled his stories. Wood's silence was comforting, not lonely. He lost himself in his favorite PlayStation games to escape his months-long grief. In the quiet wooden cabin, the console hum and screen glow created a small world of normal life. He let Midnight sniff the snow and run around the clearing on long walks. This was a peaceful way to say goodbye to the place and wrap his father's memories in a positive ending. But on the third day, things got strange and unsettling. The third morning, the boy looked out the window. A massive snowstorm hit overnight. The driveway, clearing, and trees were covered in several feet of fresh snow, which was still falling in thick white blankets. After going downstairs, he saw his father's car completely buried out the front window. The driveway was white, and the hood was covered in snow. He looked at the heavy white flakes falling from the sky and decided not to shovel snow, clean the car, or drive down mountain roads. A storm like this could make mountain roads dangerous, so he didn't want to risk it. He thought staying inside all day would be safer and more fun. His lazy day with Midnight included snacking and playing video games. The third day snowstorm was a mountain blizzard. The massive pine trees around the cabin groaning and swayed as the wind howled. The snow was so thick that the front windows were completely covered in white. The cabin felt smaller and more isolated than ever, with no outside world exposure. Before turning on his console, the boy watched the fire die down to glowing embers in a heavy blanket all morning. He played a first-person shooter game, using the gunshots and action to drown out the forest silence. As the day went on, the storm intensified, and drafts of cold air whistling through the cabin's wooden walls made him feel like the wilderness was slowly entering. Midnight started pacing by the front door during the day to tell him she needed to use the bathroom. The boy donned his winter coat, boots, and unlocked the front door. He took Midnight out onto the front porch and let her run in the snow. He looked across the clearing's pure white ground from the porch, shivering in the cold. It was then he noticed something odd. Snow footprints were visible. They were clean and had unfilled edges from snowfall. The boy knew the footprints were not his because this was his first time outside all day. He wondered who made them. The nearest neighbors were miles away and elderly, so they rarely walked through the dense woods, especially in a snowstorm. To see better, the boy left the porch and approached the tracks. He saw that the footprints came from the thick tree line. They entered the clearing, curved around the cabin's front, and headed back to the steep mountain slope. He tracked them using the skills his father taught him on hunting trips. He noticed the footprints' long stride, suggesting the maker was tall. The snow impressions were deep and heavy, but the steps were spaced out carefully, as if the person had been moving quickly but carefully. He watched the tracks circle the cabin, noticing how close they were to the windows. The person approached the living room window glass, stood for a moment, and then headed back. The boy felt a subtle chill unrelated to the cold air. He followed the footprints up the steep slope behind the cabin, watching them disappear into the mountain's thick pine trees. Due to the steep slope, a normal person would have needed their hands to balance, but there were no handprints in the snow. It looked like this person walked up the steep mountain slope with ease. He tried to convince himself it was a local hunter or hiker who got lost in the storm. Bringing Midnight inside, he locked the door and forgot about the footprints. He played video games again, but a tiny seed of unease had been planted. He tried to focus on his game, but he kept looking at the windows, wondering if someone was watching the cabin from the trees. The boy played video games in the loft as afternoon turned to evening. Midnight slept peacefully on the rug beside his chair. The snow kept falling, burying the world in white silence. By 5, the forest was dark as the light faded early. The boy went downstairs to cook. After eating a simple meal at the counter, he decided to close the house for the night. He circled the first floor, drawing heavy blackout curtains over the large front windows. He closed all the blinds, double-checked that all first-floor windows were locked, and then went to the heavy front door. The deadbolt clicked as he turned it. After checking the cabin's security, he returned to the loft master bedroom. Midnight followed him into the large bed and settled near the head of the bed next to his pillow. After turning off the bedside lamp, the boy closed his eyes. He felt Midnight tense up after only a few minutes of lying in the dark. Though silent, the dog stood up and stood still on the mattress. This boy opened his eyes and looked at her. In the faint light from the second-floor window, he saw Midnight's ears perk up and her eyes focused on the wooden stairs to the first floor. It was like she heard something downstairs. The boy did not panic because Midnight was usually a calm dog, but she could be jumpy in new places. He petted her back to calm her and get her to lie down. Midnight ignored him. She jumped off the bed and ran down the stairs into the first-floor darkness. The boy sat up in bed, his heart racing some. He remained still, listening intently. Though the cabin was locked, he suddenly remembered the fresh footprints in the snow from earlier that day. He heard Midnight pacing downstairs on the hardwood floor. He heard her claws rapidly clicking against the wood from the front door to the windows and back. She made that sound when she was desperate to go outside. The boy lay there, growing uneasy. He didn't want to go downstairs in the dark, but he couldn't lie there while his dog ran around. He breathed deeply, got out of bed, and descended the stairs. After descending the stairs, he saw Midnight by the front door. She stared at the door crack with stiff body and forward-pointing ears. She whined silently, pleading for release. She probably needed to use the bathroom after drinking all that water, the boy thought. The deadbolt was unlocked and the door opened by his hand. Cold night air rushed into the warm cabin. Standing on the threshold, he expected Midnight to go out in the snow and do her business. But she didn't. Midnight slowly stepped onto the porch, head bowed. She stalked forward, her eyes fixed on the clearing's darkness. She stopped at the porch edge and stared at the sitting tree in the center of the clearing. Shivering in his t-shirt, the boy stood on the porch. He looked out into the darkness, but saw nothing. Only the massive, silent pine trees against the dark sky were visible. He whispered to Midnight to hurry to the bathroom so they could go back inside. The dog ignored him completely. She was frozen, her muscles tense, ready to run into the woods. The boy felt a chilling dread. The forest silence became heavy and hostile. He realized that whatever Midnight was looking at was out in the dark, and he didn't want his dog to chase it through the woods. He approached, grabbed Midnight by the collar, and pulled her toward the cabin. He pulled her in, locked the deadbolt, and closed the heavy wooden door. He looked through the door's small glass window one last time, but saw nothing but darkness. He quickly swept the first floor, checking every lock again to ensure security. He took Midnight and went upstairs. Midnight refused to return upstairs. The boy had to pull her up the stairs. The dog refused to get on the bed when they returned to the master bedroom. Instead, she stood at the loft edge, staring down the staircase, ears perked. She occasionally looked at the boy as if asking him why they were staying inside, then looked down the stairs. The boy retreated under the covers to calm his racing thoughts. He kept telling himself it was a deer or coyote that had wandered into the clearing. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. About 30 minutes passed silently. Just as the boy was falling asleep, a loud sound broke the silence. He heard a heavy, rhythmic thud above him. He froze, eyes wide. Sound came from the roof. The sound was loud and clear because the roof was directly above the master bedroom ceiling without an attic. He heard heavy footsteps on the wooden shingles. The sound was hollow, like animal hooves, according to the boy. About 6 steps were counted. Midnight immediately looked up at the ceiling, tracking the noise. Sitting up, the boy tried to think of a reason. He wondered how a deer or moose got on the cabin roof. The roof was steep and high. An animal couldn't have jumped onto it without a ladder or from one of the massive pine trees around the house. However, a tree jump would have made a loud, massive crash. He heard no crash. It seemed like whatever was up there had just appeared on the roof or had been there silently for a long time and just started walking. The roof footsteps stopped abruptly. Her head snapped down, and Midnight looked at the sliding glass door to the second-floor balcony. The door was closed, and the heavy blackout curtains were drawn to block the view. But Midnight stared at the glass like she knew something was there. Fear swept over the boy. Although he was a tough 17-year-old, being alone in the dark woods miles from help made him feel small. He avoided that balcony door. He wanted to hide under the covers and ignore everything, but he knew he couldn't wait in the dark for whatever it was to take action. He needed to know what was outside. He slid out of bed, shaking legs. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from the bedside table and held it tightly. Midnight walked beside him as he slowly approached the sliding glass door. He inhaled deeply and pulled back the blackout curtain. Outside was pitch black. He couldn't see through the glass. After opening the sliding door lock, he slowly pushed it open. Coming out onto the snowy balcony, the cold winter wind hit his face. Midnight nervously sniffed the air after him. His first thought was to look up. He pointed his flashlight at the roof above the balcony, expecting to see a deer, raccoon, or other animal trapped there. However, the roof was empty. He swept the light across the snowy shingles, but saw no animals or footprints from where he stood. He felt a little better. He wondered if the sound was snow sliding off the roof or his imagination. He then heard Midnight growling softly. She looked out into the dark clearing toward the sitting tree from the balcony edge, head pointing downward. The boy knew to check the yard. He raised his flashlight and swept it across the snow. He slowly moved the light from the house edge across the snow to the dense tree line. Light from the powerful beam illuminated the white ground through falling snow. He moved the light through the dark forest until it hit the sitting tree. A boy turned off the flashlight. He sat on the thick parallel branch 20 feet above the ground. The boy froze, heart-stopping. His flashlight was focused on the tree figure. He was extremely tall and thin. His long arms gripped another branch above him as he crouched on the branch. Despite wearing dark, simple clothes, his face was exposed. He stared at the balcony boy with an unnaturally open mouth. He didn't blink. He stood still like a statue, holding onto the branches and staring at the 17-year-old with terrifying intensity. The sitting tree was less than 50 yards from the balcony, and the boy's flashlight highlighted every detail of the man's face. The boy's brain took a few seconds to process what he saw. A human, or something that looked like a human, was perched in a tree in a snowstorm, staring at him with a wide mouth. He felt the sight's terror physically. He panicked. His violent shaking caused him to drop the heavy flashlight. It clattered on the balcony's wooden floor. The noise made Midnight bark fiercely. The boy stood on the balcony in pitch-black darkness. Knowing the figure in the tree could see him, but not him, made him feel vulnerable. He desperately searched the balcony's snowy floor for the flashlight. Finally, his hand touched the cold metal. He grabbed it, turned it on, and instantly pointed the light at the sitting tree branch. Empty branch. The tall man left. The boy quickly swept the light down to the snowy ground beneath the tree, expecting to see someone running or hiding in the brush. There was nothing. The clearing was quiet, and the snow fell as usual. The boy acted immediately. He pushed Midnight back into the master bedroom by her collar and ran after her. He closed the sliding glass door, locked it, and closed the heavy blackout curtains to block the dark outside. He ran around the bedroom, turning off every light to make sure the cabin was dark so no one could see inside. After crawling back onto the bed, he pulled the blankets to his chest. Midnight crept up beside him, pressing against his side. She no longer growled or wanted outside. She shook, sensing the boy's terror. The boy lay in the pitch-black room, staring at the ceiling and losing control. He kept wondering if what he saw was real. How could a man sit on a 20-foot branch in a tree without lower branches? He got up there, quickly and quietly. How? Why was he crouched with his mouth open, staring at the cabin? The man's unblinking eyes and gaping mouth were etched in his mind. He recalled the roof footsteps he heard moments earlier. Was that the same man? If this person could climb a 20-foot tree effortlessly, he could climb the cabin roof. The boy checked his phone. Middle of the night. With a heavy heart, he realized he had several hours before sunrise. He was alone in miles of deep forest with no neighbors or way to get help. Someone or something stalked him from the darkness in the cabin. Room silence became agonizing. The boy tried to listen through his heavy breathing and heartbeat. After what seemed like an eternity, a sound broke the silence. The tapping was rhythmic and soft. Sound came from downstairs. The sound was like a fingernail gently tapping glass. Tap, tap, tap. Freezing, the boy held his breath. He and Midnight turned toward the stairs, listening to the first-floor noise. Although the boy knew all the downstairs doors and windows were locked, the tapping was very deliberate. A tree branch scraping the house or wind blowing against the wood were not the sounds. A steady, rhythmic tap on the front door glass. Panic hit the boy. He knew he wouldn't check downstairs. He lay still, praying that anyone outside would think the cabin was empty and leave. Front door tapping stopped after a few minutes. Long hours of tapping destroyed the boy's sense of time. Every second felt like an eternity, and the bedroom darkness seemed to close in on him. Under the heavy blankets, sweat dripped from his forehead despite the cold draft. He strains to hear the rhythmic tap, tap, tap that seemed to echo throughout the cabin. He counted the taps to find a pattern, but the sound was random. It started on one window, paused for a few minutes, and then started on another wall. It was deliberate, slow torture. He knew that running to his father's car in the pitch blackness would require running through deep snow, and the car was likely buried too deep to start or drive away. He was totally dependent on the outside world. He felt a primal fear that paralyzes you by locking up your muscles and keeping your breath in your throat. The boy breathed quietly, hoping the nightmare was over. He heard slow, heavy footsteps in the snow outside the cabin, walking along the side. A moment later, tapping resumed. It was on the cabin side wall this time. A solid tapping against the house's heavy wooden logs made it louder. The sound slowly moved along the wall, tapping, tapping, as if someone outside was walking around the perimeter, dragging their hand or finger along the wood. The boy watched the bedroom wall, knowing that only a few inches of wood and insulation separated him from the outside world. The tapping reached the cabin's back. The boy's heart stopped. He heard a clear, sharp tap on the tiny bathroom window. The first-floor bathroom window behind his bed was narrow and small. The back of the cabin was built into the mountainside, elevating the ground outside to almost level with the second floor. The tapping was now a few feet from the bedridden boy. Tap, tap, tap. The thin glass and close sound made the boy feel like the person was in the room with him. His body shook under the blankets as he closed his eyes. The bathroom window tapping stopped, but the snow footsteps did not. The boy heard snow crunch as the person crossed the cabin. New rhythmic tapping began on the opposite wall, slowly moving from the back to the front of the house. It was a slow, methodical cabin exterior search. The person tapped every wall, window, and entry point one by one. After tapping the large windows next to the kitchen, the cabin's front door was tapped again. The kid felt hunted. He realized this wasn't a random passerby. That person knew he was inside, and they were playing a sick, terrifying game with him, telling him they were out there, surrounding him, and he had nowhere to run. When the boy thought his nerves were shot, the downstairs tapping stopped. Silence for a few minutes. The boy had his muscles tense, waiting for the next sound in the dark. Then he heard heavy, slow footsteps on the second-floor balcony's wooden stairs. His heart sank into his stomach. The person climbed the balcony. A second later, the tapping began on the master bedroom's large sliding glass doors a few feet from his bed. Tap, tap, tap. The boy looked at the heavy blackout curtains, knowing that the tall man was on his belly looking at the dark room behind that thin layer of fabric and glass. Slowly tapping, the glass continued. The room was filled with a constant, annoying sound. The boy feared the man would break the glass or force the sliding door lock. He knew he had nowhere to run if the door opened. He clung to midnight, frozen in fear, waiting for the glass to break. Glass did not shatter. The sound stopped after several minutes of tapping on the balcony door. After hearing the wooden balcony creak as the weight shifted, the boy heard someone climbing onto the roof above him. Ceiling tapping began shortly after. It moved slowly across the roof above him. Tap, tap, tap. All night, the person paced the roof, tapping the wood. No sleep was had by the boy. He lay in the dark, listening to the rhythmic tapping above him and watching the room's shadows change as the hours passed. The longest night of his life. He felt powerless in an endless nightmare. After hours of psychological torture, the boy saw the first dawn light peeking through the blackout curtains. He was too scared to move after the roof tapping stopped. The boy got up from bed as the sun slowly rose over the mountains, casting a bright, cold light on the snowy landscape. His body was stiff and exhausted from nighttime tension. He slowly approached the sliding glass door and inhaled. He pulled back the blackout curtain edge. The balcony was empty. He blinked as the morning sun reflected off the white snow. He opened the sliding door slowly and stepped outside into the cold morning air. Midnight sniffed the ground as she followed him out. He looked down at the balcony floor first. Fresh snow from the night was covered in a mess of footprints. Someone appeared to have been pacing the balcony for hours. He walked to the balcony edge, turned around, and looked up at the cabin's steep roof. The roof was covered in footprints in the fresh snow. He saw a racetrack of tracks crossing the shingles above his bedroom. The boy then walked to the balcony's wooden railing to look down. Footprints covered the cabin clearing. He saw a dense circular path of tracks that circled the cabin, passing every window and wall where he had heard the nighttime tapping. They looked like heavy, bare feet or thin-soled shoes packing the snow into a track. The boy watched the footprints. After seeing the path start at the cabin base, he followed the tracks across the clearing to the sitting tree. The footprints ended at the tree base. The boy imagined the tall man crouched in the dark on the thick parallel branch 20 feet above him. Another set of footprints left the tree base and disappeared into the dense forest and pine tree wall. The boy was adamant. He ran back inside the cabin, grabbed his clothes, video game console, and bags, and threw them in without folding. Cleanup and packing were unimportant to him. He wanted out as fast as possible. He grabbed midnight, ran downstairs, unlocked the front door, and ran to his father's car. He put his bags in the trunk, got in the driver's seat, and started the engine. He only cleared the windshield enough to see the road ahead, not all the snow. He put the car in reverse, backed down the snowy driveway, and left the cabin without looking back. He returned home, exhausted, pale, and shaking. His mother immediately noticed something was wrong. He cried on the couch as he told her everything that happened at the cabin. He described the footprints, roof footsteps, tall man in the sitting tree, and constant window and wall tapping. His tale horrified his mother. She saw her son's trauma in his eyes and knew he wouldn't lie. She called the Mount Bachelor Sheriff's Department immediately. The report was taken seriously, and a deputy investigated the cabin. After several hours, the deputy arrived at the property. The heavy snowstorm had turned into a light drizzle as the temperature rose. The fresh snow on the roof and balcony had melted and fallen off, destroying much of the evidence. The deputy found some packed snow around the cabin base and sitting tree, confirming that someone had been walking around the house, but the melting snow had erased the footprints. The deputy searched the vast forest for residents, but found none. During the investigation, the deputy asked the mother and boy if his late father had any enemies or if anyone was targeting the family. They couldn't name anyone. People liked his father, who had no enemies or business disputes. Another option was suggested by the deputy. Since the cabin was listed online, he said it was public. This allowed anyone with an internet connection to see the cabin's photos, isolated location, and likely empty interior. A drifter, squatter, or local predator may have seen the listing, realized the cabin was rarely occupied, and decided to use or scout it out. When the 17-year-old boy arrived alone, they may have played a terrifying psychological game with him. The boy felt queasy, thinking about someone watching him from the dark forest and planning their approach using a public real estate listing. The deputy searched local records after filing his report at the station. This was not the first time a Mount Bachelor cabin reported strange events. Locals reported several phantom tapper sightings over the past decade. These winter reports came from isolated cabins. Property owners reported hearing rhythmic tapping on their windows and walls at night, always accompanied by roof footsteps. Many owners found strange footprints in the snow the next morning, but the culprits were never found. Some older locals whispered about mountain drifters who lived in caves or makeshift shelters in the wilderness, completely disconnected from society. Other stories involved ancient forest spirits who didn't want humans on their land. Regardless, the police never caught anyone, and the cases remained unsolved. Quickly after the incident, the family sold the cabin. After learning they would never own that property again, the 17-year-old boy was relieved. It changed him forever, and he never returned to Mount Bachelor. He was afraid of the dark for years afterward and couldn't sleep without checking his door and window locks. He often lay in bed listening to the quiet sounds of his house, afraid of hearing that slow, rhythmic tapping on his bedroom window. He still doesn't know who or what stalked him that night. Was it a local who knew the family was selling the cabin and wanted to terrorize the occupants? A mentally unstable woods drifter? Or was it something more sinister and unexplainable? The image of the tall man on the branch with his mouth open and unblinking eyes will haunt him forever. Many thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts on today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. Kayla was living the life that so many people dream of having in the year 2010, and it was a year when she felt very fulfilled. She had reached the senior year of her studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, a school that is well known for its breathtaking campus that is located right on the Pacific Ocean, and of course, its well-known party scene. She had reached this point in her education. In addition to being brilliant and self-motivated, Kayla was majoring in communications, and she had her entire future planned out. She was also very well organized. But in addition to that, she was also able to take pleasure in herself. Not only did she have a tight-knit group of friends who were also her roommates, but the small rental house that she lived with two wonderful housemates was situated just a few blocks away from the campus. Despite the fact that it was a little worn around the edges, it was full with laughter and debates about studies late into the night. It was the kind of atmosphere that you see in movies. On a particular Friday evening, the atmosphere was brimming with the normal excitement that is connected with the conclusion of the week. Kayla and her friends managed to find themselves at a large party that was held not too far from their home. The party was situated just a short distance away. The music was playing at a very loud volume, and the house was absolutely packed with people. Everyone was in a particularly happy mood. Although Kayla was having a lovely time, laughing and catching up with friends, she began to get an overpowering feeling of exhaustion as the night proceeded. This was despite the fact that she was having a wonderful time. During the previous week, she had been attending lectures and studying for exams, and the only thing that she could think about was getting into her own bed. I had a difficult week ahead of me. The next thing she did was turn to her friends and query as to whether or not anyone else was ready to depart for the evening. On the other hand, they were all still bursting with vigor and did not want the celebration to finish, even though it was getting close to its conclusion. The reason that Kayla notified them that she was going to go home by herself from work was because she did not want to give the impression that she was a pessimist. It was not a serious cause for anxiety, this. It was literally only a 5-minute walk away from her house, and it was a straight shot along a street that was well lit and familiar. The distance was only 5 minutes. It had been 100 times before that she had walked it, both during the day and at night. After saying her goodbyes, she silently left the house through the front door and started the short journey back home, taking delight in the energizing night air as she traveled. Sarah and Jessica, who were her roommates, had come to the conclusion that they would prefer to spend the evening in a tranquil setting when they returned to their residence. It was determined that they would enjoy a more relaxed evening because they were also seniors and were under the weight of the responsibilities that came with their academic obligations. They had invited a couple of their friends over, but they were just hanging out in the living room, drinking a bottle of wine and chatting with their friends. Despite the fact that they had invited over a couple of their friends, what they encountered was a Friday evening that was uneventful and characterized by harmony. Kayla went through the motions of looking for her keys when she had gotten at her front door, and then she opened the door for herself. She had imagined that the house would be a quiet place, and she was right. After some consideration, she came to the conclusion that her roommates and their friends were probably already in their own bedrooms at this moment. Following her entrance into the building and the subsequent closing of the door behind her, she tilted her head to the right and cast a gaze in that direction. There was a large sofa that was pushed up against the main wall of their living room, which was somewhat smaller than the rest of the space. In addition to it, there was a guy occupant resting on the sofa. It was a blanket that was pulled all the way up to his chin, and he was lying down with his head tucked under it. He was relaxing. When he looked at her, his eyes were wide open, and he was staring at her in a direct manner. During this brief pause, Kayla made a brief stop. It was as if she had no awareness whatsoever of his existence. The discovery of a stranger sleeping on the couch in a college residence, particularly on a Friday night, was not completely out of the ordinary. On the other hand, it was not completely out of the ordinary neither. At that moment, she immediately made the assumption that he must be a friend of Sarah or Jessica's friends, someone who had probably had a small amount of alcohol and was currently sleeping off the affects of their drinking. She gave him a small nod that was polite but obviously fatigued, and then she started walking across the room in the direction of the corridor that led to her bedroom. She was exhausted but polite. On the other hand, she felt an odd sensation in the nape of her neck as she walked. This occurred while she was walking. It didn't feel quite right, especially for me. As she casually looked back over her shoulder, she noticed the man who was seated on the couch. He drew her attention during this moment. Within that fraction of a second, he exerted some kind of movement. In addition to removing his head from the cushion, he had also changed the blanket so that it was little lower than it had been previously. It was no longer enough for him to merely look at her. Rather, he was observing her with a level of intensity that appeared to be improperly written. A terrible and gloomy image was shown to her, and it prompted the hair on her arms to stand up in response to the moment. At that same moment, each and every alarm bell that she had been playing in her thoughts began to ring. On the face of that partygoer, there was no indication of how exhausted they were. On the other hand, that was an entirely different problem. Fear was a powerful and fundamental emotion that she experienced, and it engulfed her completely. Her speed intensified, and rather than walking in a casual manner, she was hurriedly making her way to her room. She wanted to get there as quickly as possible. It was the final time that she appeared to turn around. When she was finally able to reach the entrance to her bedroom, she hurriedly went inside and then firmly shut the door behind her. Following that, she engaged in an activity that she had almost never considered doing before. She bent down and turned the knob on her doorknob until she heard the lock click into place. While she was doing this, she waited for the lock to click into place. She could count on one hand the number of times she had closed the door to her bedroom during the 2 years that she had lived in that house when she had been there. She had been there for as long as she could remember. To put it another way, there was never a precondition for it to exist. Tonight, on the other hand, she had a hammering sensation in her stomach that indicated she ought to have that barrier. A few minutes later, the exhilaration that she had felt as a result of the strange encounter started to gradually go away, and the exhaustion that she had been experiencing during the week started to take control of her actions. She went into a deep sleep in a few minutes after falling asleep. A weird sound awoke Kayla from her deep sleep 2 hours later. She had been sleeping for a long time. For a considerable amount of time, she had been asleep. A soft tapping sound could be heard, but it was persistent throughout the entire process. During the beginning of the time period, she was completely and utterly confused. The combination of the sleep she had obtained and the couple of beers she had consumed earlier had both contributed to the cloudiness of her mind. Her space was utterly devoid of light. As she sat up in her bed, she made an effort to identify the origin of the alarming sound. The noise was coming from the direction of the exit. If there is a limb of the tree pressing against the glass, has it been removed? And in point of fact, it was far closer than that. As her senses gradually restored to their usual state, she became conscious of what it was that she was experiencing. It appeared as though someone was tapping their fingers on the wooden door that would lead to her bedroom, and it sounded as though they were doing so. She looked at the murky silhouette of her door, which was causing her to feel a sense of perplexity. Who would be doing something like that at this hour of the night? That is the question. Perhaps it was one of her roommates who needed to question about anything that was related to her responsibilities. On the other hand, why would they tap for such a short period of time? Following that, she recalled the individual who was, at the time, seated on the couch. Suddenly, she felt a tiny acceleration in the rate at which her heart was beating. Maybe he was the one? And if that were to be the case, what exactly was it that he wanted? A momentary pause was seen in the rhythmic drumming that had been going on. The silence that followed was one that was substantial and strained, and it did not let up at any point. After that, a new sound gradually replaced the previous one in the mix. The sounds were similar to those of someone scratching them. The direction of her door was the source of a scratching sound that was barely perceptible despite its proximity. Kayla's feelings of confusion and confusion grew into frustration as time went on. Okay, it was clear that this was the individual who was seated on the couch. There is a high probability that he was under the influence of alcohol and that he thought he was being hilarious by pulling some kind of foolish joke. This motion was not something she was in the mood for, in addition to the fact that she was fatigued. During the time that she was sitting there in bed, she pondered whether or not she should simply get up, throw open the door, and tell him to stop being so unreasonable. However, the itching changed before she could convince herself to get out of bed. This occurred before she was able to get dressed. It became more upsetting and louder as time went on. The sound was no longer that of fingernails, rather it was something else as well. The texture was more grainy and it had a metallic aspect to it. The tone of the music changed from one of playfulness to one of aggression. It was no longer playful. During the time when the sound was being heard, someone was making an attempt to enter the room through the door. The negative feeling that she had previously received from him came flooding back to her, and it was increased by a factor of 3. She experienced a decrease in her annoyance, and in its place, she was filled with genuine panic. After some consideration, she came to the realization that there was no way that she would ever open the door. Instead of reaching for it, she reached for her phone, which was resting on the nightstand across from her. During the moment that she was retrieving her text messages, she became aware that her hands were trembling slightly. She had texted Sarah, who was her roommate, a brief message. Sarah was the recipient of the message. She then pressed the send button and waited, her gaze fixated on the door leading to her bedroom as she listened to the scratching that continued. "Hey, could you please come out here? Your friend is acting really strange and trying to get into my room. It had taken just a moment. Now there are 2 of them." However, there was no response. It continued to scratch, and the sound that it made was one that was both persistent and threatening. So, it's plausible that Sarah was a heavy sleeper. All right, let's investigate. Jessica, the other roommate, was the recipient of a new text message from Kayla, and she had the opportunity to read it. The message that she typed out was, for the most part, virtually identical. She waited once more after sending the text message that she had sent. "He was outside my door, scratching at it and freaking me out. Jessica, please come out to the living room and get your friend. He's outside my door, scratching at it and freaking me out." The scratching continued, and it was a sound that was both persistent and unnerving. This was the case even if the residence was normally silent. The other side of the coin is that there was no answer. Despite the fact that she continued to consume food, she was beginning to get a terrible feeling of worry in her stomach. What reasons did they not react to your question? This marked the end of the scratching that had been going on. Kayla was anxiously anticipating that he had finally given up and vanished, so she held her breath for a brief length of time. She was holding her breath. However, the silence was broken by a new sound that was even more terrifying than the one that had been there before. A metallic clink and rattle was made as a result of her doorknob being jiggled, which was the sound that was heard. His intention was to inspect the lock, thus he was making a concerted effort to turn the handle. By this point, Kayla had reached an extreme level of annoyance and had developed a profound worry. Certainly, this was not a joke at all. Someone who was intoxicated would not do something like this. Someone was attempting to enter her room by using force against her in order to successfully do so. She was able to gather her calm and yelled out, "Hey! Stop it! Get away from my door!" She made an effort to convey an angry and authoritative tone in the hopes of diverting his attention away from her. Her voice, on the other hand, was shaking visibly with fear. Despite this, the jiggling persisted ceaselessly. It was almost as if he had not even noticed that she was a part of the room. She was well aware that by this point, texting was not going to be an effective method of communication. Her calling them and rousing them up was something that was required of her. It was then that they would enter the room and deal with the person in question. "Sarah," she stated as she phoned Sarah's number. After the phone had rung once or twice, Sarah finally picked it up, and by the time she did, her voice was dripping with the weight of sleep. "Hello?" It was a loud and unpleasant muttering that Kayla used when she spoke. "Sarah, you need to get up right now. Come out into the living room and tell your friend to knock it off. He's trying to get into my room and he's totally harassing me." A little lull occurred in the conversation that was taking place on the other end of the line. It was clear to me that Sarah was still attempting to make sense of what Kayla was saying, since she appeared to be perplexed by what she was hearing. "Kayla, what are you talking about?" "What friend?" "The guy!" Kayla yelled out as her fury and dread began to intensify before her eyes. "The guy you had over. The one sleeping on our couch." Sarah's dreamy perplexity was abruptly replaced with a tone that resonated with a chilling clarity and concern. Instantaneously, Sarah's confusion had disappeared without a trace. "Kayla, we didn't have anyone over. Our friends left hours ago. There isn't anyone on the couch. If there is somebody out there, you need to call the police. Right now." The words were like a blow to the gut for Kayla, and she could feel them hitting her. Suddenly, her bodily fluids turned ice. The individual who was sitting on the couch was not a friend of the person sitting there. His identity was unknown to anyone. As soon as she got at her house, she discovered that an unknown person had been there at their residence. At this very moment, she was being confronted by an individual whom she did not know, who was attempting to smash down the door that led to her bedroom. She experienced a surge of pure adrenaline coursing through her body like a torrent. Her mental state turned into one of surviving the situation. The command that she gave to her roommate was very clear, and she delivered it in a voice that was eerily calm. "Sarah, lock your door. Lock it immediately." Both the jiggling of her doorknob and the violent scratching came to a complete halt at that same moment, as if the intruder had been paying attention to what was going on. The home was silent for the third time in a row. Kayla strained her ears attentively in response to the question of whether or not there was any sign of where he had gone. If he was on the phone with her, was he able to hear her? He just gave up, didn't he? During the few dreadful seconds that passed, there was absolutely nothing about it. The silence that had been there up until that point was then broken by a crash that was exceedingly loud and originated from the opposite end of the house. There was one more one that followed it, and then there was another one that followed it. It was the sound of a body being thrown into a door that was heard by those who were present. Moving on from her room, he was now making an effort to compel his way into the bedroom that was occupied by her two roommates. He was no longer in her room at that point. At that moment, Kayla became aware of cries emanating from the room of her roommates, and she immediately began to scream herself. The sounds of complete and utter fear could be heard throughout the entirety of the house. During the time when Kayla was experiencing a state of fear, she was able to, in some way, call 911. At the same time, she was frantically attempting to convey to the operator what was going on, which was that there was a man in their house who was attempting to enter their rooms. After she had finished explaining the situation, she was able to hear the sound of wood splintering coming from the direction of the corridor. The sound of the hammering, which was accompanied by her own panicked breathing, was not the only noise that she heard. She also heard another sounds. The distinct sound of their sliding glass door in the back of the house being jerked open and then shut again and again until being shut again at the end of the process. It was at that moment that she became aware of the majestic and penetrating sound of sirens, which initially started off as a faint sound, but gradually became more and more audible. The law enforcement officers were present. At the same time that blue and red lights flashed through the window through which she was sleeping, the walls of her bedroom were painted with a flurry of colors being applied in a hectic manner. Kayla was able to pick up on the demands that were being yelled out by the officers who were stationed outside. She heard the loud thud of their own front door being forced open, followed by the sound of boots on their wooden floors and the sound of police officers yelling, "Police!" clear as they made their way through the house, room by room. She yelled out, "Santa Barbara Police Department, have you come out and show yourself?" After what seemed like an endless length of time had passed, she was startled to hear a loud knock on the door of her bedroom. The shaking in Kayla's hands was so extreme that she was unable to turn the latch on the door as she ran to the entrance. She yelled as she hurried to the door, "This is the police!" "Is anyone in there?" as she entered the building. When she opened it, she was instantly faced by two law enforcement officers who had their weapons drawn and immediately lowered them when they saw her. They had been waiting for her to open it. She was led into the living room where her two roommates, Sarah and Jessica, were already there, wrapped in blankets, and appeared pale and terrified. After a short period of time, they investigated her room and then led her into the main room. Both the yard and the exterior of the house were thoroughly searched by the officers who finished their investigation. After leaving the premises, the trespasser had left. He had vanished into the shadows in the same amount of time that he had appeared in the first place. As soon as the authorities had made certain that the location was secure, they began fitting together the pieces of what had just taken place. The very first thing that they did was to take the girls outside to the side of the house in the direction of a door that they did not use very frequently. The flashlight carried by a law enforcement officer was pointed in the direction of the doorknob. The response that he gave was, "It appears that this is how he got in." Kayla, along with her roommates, leaned in to acquire a better glimpse at the situation. After using the beam of the flashlight to highlight the doorknob and the latch plate, it was observed that there were a lot of deep scratches and pry marks all around the doorknob and over the latch plate. This piece of wood had been fractured and gouged in several places. A law enforcement officer stated that it seemed as though someone had used a tool, either a knife or a screwdriver, to force their way inside the facility by jimmying the lock. This was indicated by the officer's statement. There wasn't just a drunk person who happened to walk into the wrong house by accident. It was more than that. Here was an attempt to break and enter. An attempt to break into the residence. It was a boring and chilly experience as the truth of the scenario began to soak in, and it was all because of the situation. Following their return to the building, the authorities asked Kayla to recount her story to them, beginning with the moment she arrived at her residence. The unnerving vision of the man sitting on the couch, her decision to shut the door, and the horrifying sounds that followed were all repeated by her as she led them down the corridor to her bedroom. She also described to them the awful sounds that followed. One of the officers flashed his flashlight on the door itself as she stood in front of her closed bedroom door, displaying how he had been scratching and jiggling the knob. She was demonstrating how he had been doing everything. During the time that she was standing there, she provided the demonstration. Every single one of them was present at that very time. To her surprise, it was a great deal more upsetting than she had anticipated. Scratches and gouges of a severe kind were done in a furious manner, and they covered the entire region that was surrounding her doorknob. In other places, the wood had been torn, and the metal of the doorknob itself had been scratched and dented throughout its surface. There were also some locations where the wood had been shredded. He had been making a concerted effort to force the lock open, to do damage to it, and to attain access to her. On closer inspection, it became clear that he had not merely been jiggling the handle, rather, he had been engaging in all of these activities. It was very alarming to see the amount of force that he had been putting to a tool. During the process of the police officer directing the beam of his flashlight downward towards the ground, the light caught something that was made of metal. This situation arose as a result of the officer moving the beam. It was there, on the ground just in front of her door, that she found a set of scissors and a little kitchen knife that was quite sharp. That they were not coming from their kitchen was not the case. Nobody had ever seen them before. Nobody had ever seen them before. Within the corridor, the mood became more tense, and still, as time went on, the tools that were sitting on the ground were the primary center of everyone's attention at that moment. Both the tools that he had used to break into their home and the tools that he had taken to her bedroom door after he had broken into their home are included in this collection. The officers exchanged a somber glance with one another as they looked at each other. One of them got down on their knees and studied the knife and scissors without touching them. This allowed them to examine them without touching them. Following that, he got to his feet and directed his attention to Kayla in a forthright manner. His words created a horrifying picture of what they believed had taken place, and he then proceeded to reenact what they believed had taken place. He went on to explain that the burglar most likely used that knife and those scissors to forcefully open the side door. He said that this was the most likely explanation for the burglar's actions. On a Friday night in a college town, it is quite probable that he was a burglar who anticipated that the residence would be vacant. This is a very plausible scenario. Following his successful infiltration into the building, he began searching for anything that might be swiftly taken, such as laptops, cash, or wallets. It is probable that he was in the middle of inspecting the living room when he was caught off guard by the sound of the front door opening. He was completely taken aback by the sound of the door opening. The fact that Kayla had arrived was the reason why his plan was unsuccessful. It was only a few seconds before he responded to my question. As soon as he noticed the couch leaning against the wall, he snatched the blanket that was draped over it and threw himself down with the intention of drawing the cover up to his chin. This was his final attempt to disseminate information about himself. His anticipation was that she would simply walk by and that she would not even notice him in the dim light. He was expecting her to overlook him. An abrupt and hurried decision was made at that precise moment. Nevertheless, Kayla did take note of him. However, what is much more disturbing is the fact that she stared him in the eye. An explanation of the dramatic shift that had taken place was supplied by the officer during that brief span of time. When you saw his face, the officer said in a tone that was low and serious, you were no longer just an obstacle in a burglary. You became a witness, and there is a good chance that this made you his primary target. The officer's tone was low and serious. They are under the impression that he remained in the living room for a few minutes after she entered her room, and then he left the room. It is highly probable that he was actively considering the best way to proceed with the situation. Regardless of whether or not he made an effort to sneak out via the back door, he was aware that she had detected him. Those individuals were able to identify him. His impression of her was that she was a loose end that needed to be handled and given attention. Consequently, he arrived to a conclusion. He had no intention of abandoning a witness he had brought with him. When he had finished gathering the tools that he had used to enter the house, which included the knife and the scissors, he then proceeded to stroll down the hallway until he reached her door. There is a high probability that he made an initial effort to unlock the door by tapping the handle instead. Immediately, as he became aware that it was locked, he began making fruitless attempts to open it by utilizing the instruments that were available to him. A plausible explanation for the tapping that she initially heard was that he was trying to find a vulnerable area in order to remain silent. This was one of the probable explanations. The more frustrated he became, however, the more aggressive he became, scraping and gouging at the lock in an attempt to break out of the situation where he was trapped. He had a strong desire to set foot inside the structure. It is believed by the police that the phone contact was the most important aspect that ultimately prevented her death. During the time that Kayla was in contact with the intruder, she would have been able to listen in on her conversation with her roommate over the phone. That she was awake and chatting on the phone, most likely with the authorities, was the first thing that he would have known. There were two other things that he would have realized, additionally to the fact that she was not the only person there in the apartment at the time of the incident. It was the presence of her roommates, who were now awake and conscious, that prompted him to make a full and utter change in his plan. His attempt to knock on Kayla's door was unsuccessful, and he hurried to the room where her roommates were staying in a state of dread. At that moment, he gave up. The loud hammering was executed as a deliberate, frantic, and disorderly move that was the final move. Perhaps he was trying to get to them in order to silence everyone, or perhaps he was simply trying to create a distraction for himself. Either way, he was possibly trying to get to them. At that very moment, however, he must have been cognizant of the sirens that were quickly approaching. He was conscious of the fact that his remaining time had run out. In a hurry, he made his way to the rear of the home, where he forced open the sliding glass door. After that, he disappeared into the complex network of dark streets and backyards that encircled the house. In addition to collecting the knife and scissors as evidence, the police department also dusted for fingerprints, recorded statements, and collected the knife. They examined the entire neighborhood, but nobody had reported seeing or hearing anything that was out of the norm until they were finished. The man was, in fact, a ghost after all. The absence of any evidence of his identification, such as his name, fingerprints, or any other identifying qualities, is a very concerning situation. What had transpired was that he had merely been present in their home, a terrifying presence, and then he had disappeared without a trace. Kayla, along with the other individuals that shared her room, experienced a huge influence as a result of the events of that night. The residence in question would not be suitable for them to live in. Every creak of the floorboards and every shadow that appeared in the corner of a room included a memory of the man who was sitting on the couch. This memory was present in every single one of these things. The plain feeling of being safe in their own home had been shattered in a matter of minutes, and it had been taken away from them. Instead, it had been taken away from them. Several days after they had violated the terms of the lease agreement, they moved out of the apartment. What-ifs were a constant source of anxiety for Kayla for a considerable amount of time. Let us imagine for a second that she had stayed at the party for 10 minutes longer than she had originally planned. Imagine for a moment that she hadn't been so worn out. What would have happened? Her thoughts kept coming back to the most terrifying question of all, which was the one that the police had asked her earlier that evening. What would have happened if she hadn't obeyed that sudden, incomprehensible instinct to lock the door to her bedroom? Her mind kept going back to the question. It seems likely that a simple, almost unthinking action, such as the little click of a lock, was what ultimately saved her life. It was a straightforward activity that just about appeared to be mindless. Whoever it was that sat on her couch and attempted to break down her door while brandishing a knife in his hand was never identified. The individual who attempted to do so was never identified. On the other hand, he was never picked up. The only thing that she knew for certain was that he was still out there, a faceless creature that had vanished back into the darkness. This was the only thing she knew for certain. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting. Till the next time we meet again. What's going on?